So here we are. It's late or early, depending on which side of midnight you find yourself on. And I think we're going to spend the next few hours with the Mad Titan, if that's all right with you. Settle in. There's no rush tonight. The thing about Thanos, the thing I keep coming back to whenever I sit down to think about him properly, is that he is one of those characters you can read for years and still feel like you've only walked the perimeter of the building. There's always another door. There's always another wing of the house. He has been written by a great many people across more than 50 years of comics, and every writer who picks him up tends to find something slightly different inside him, which is why he ends up being so much harder to pin down than the films sometimes make him look. I've spent a worrying amount of time thinking about this, more than is probably healthy for one person who isn't being paid to think about it. I have annotated copies of Jim Starlin runs on shelves in my flat. I have read the Donny Cates issues more than once, which I will explain later. I have watched Infinity War on a plane, in a hotel, on a sick day, at home with the lights low, and once with the sound off, just to watch Brolin's face do its quiet computation work. And every time I watch it, I notice some small thing I missed before. Thanos rewards that kind of attention. He's built to. If you've come to this channel before, you know roughly the shape of the evenings we have together here. Long, slow, unhurried. The kind of video you put on when the world has been a bit too much for one day, and you want a voice in the room that isn't trying to sell you anything. If you haven't been here before, hello. I'm glad you found us. The way this works is, I'm going to tell you a story tonight that starts a very long time ago in a place that no longer exists, and it's going to wander, and we're going to take detours, and at some point you are probably going to fall asleep. And that is, in fact, the entire point. I'm not trying to keep you awake. I'm trying to be company in the dark. Thanos is a useful character for this format because his story actually is, in its bones, a story about deep time, about a being who lived long enough to develop a relationship with the concept of death itself, about a man who looked at the universe, decided he had identified what was wrong with it, and then spent the next several thousand years trying to fix it, according to his own private arithmetic. The scale of him is cosmic. The interior of him is small, almost embarrassingly so. He is, when you strip the gauntlet and the throne away, a sad child who never grew out of being told he was monstrous. That's most of it. We're going to spend a long time tonight on the rest. I should also say before we go anywhere that I find him fascinating in a way I don't find most villains of his type fascinating. He is not, to my mind, a big bad. He's much more interesting than that. He is a true believer, which is rarer in fiction than it sounds, and he is also a person whose every act of grandeur is, underneath, an act of compensation. The bigger he gets, the smaller he reveals himself to be. That's the engine of him. That's the thing. There's a particular kind of villain you only get when a writer trusts that the audience can hold two contradictory feelings at once. And Thanos, at his best, is that kind of villain. He is asking the reader, and later the viewer, to take seriously a stated position that is, in plain ethical terms, monstrous, and to also notice that the person stating the position is, underneath, a fragile and wounded creature who has wrapped his fragility in robes of philosophy. The trick, when it works, is that you do not stop hating what he is doing. You just stop being able to hate him only. You start, instead, to hate him and pity him in the same moment, in different chambers of the same response, the way you might feel about a relative who did something unforgivable and was, by every reasonable measure, also the most damaged person at the table. He is that kind of figure. He is that kind of fictional problem. And the comics, when they are doing him well, lean into the problem, rather than resolving it. That, I think, is the actual point of having a character like him in a long-running cosmic mythology. He is the place the audience goes to think about a certain class of question. What does it mean to be a true believer in a wrong thing? What does it mean to dress a private wound in cosmic language? What does it mean to perform love at scales that destroy the thing being performed for? He gives the writers a stage on which to stage those questions, and he gives the readers a body to follow while they think them through. The character, in that sense, is a kind of recurring philosophical instrument, picked up and tuned slightly differently by each new writer, and put back on the shelf, and picked up again. The instrument itself is durable. The tuning changes. The notes the instrument plays, when struck, are roughly the same notes, in slightly different chords, across the decades. And that is why we are going to take our time tonight. Because if you tried to do Thanos as plot summary, the way some of the shorter videos out there do, you would end up with a list of cosmic acquisitions and battles and snaps, and you would miss almost everything that makes the character matter. The plot is, in his case, the least important layer. The interior is the thing. The wound is the thing. The way each writer reaches in and finds it again is the thing. I'm not going to rush. I want to say that now and get it out of the way. There's no quiz at the end. There's no test. We are not trying to cram the entire history of a fictional cosmic genocide heir into a tight, snappy 10-minute video where everything gets reduced to bullet points and arrow graphics. Some parts of this story are going to get more room than they strictly deserve, because I think they reward the room, and some parts that get a lot of attention elsewhere are going to get a comfortable summary, because we've all seen them many times and we don't need to walk through every punch. The Infinity War sequence on Titan, for instance, is not getting a blow-by-blow tonight. We will talk about what it means. We will talk about the look on Stark's face, and the small moment with the time stone, and the silence in the second half of the film. But we will not be reciting choreography. The story is the inside of the story. That is what we are here for. The plot is just the trellis the meaning grows on. If you enjoy this sort of thing, the long, quiet kind of video, the kind you put on when you want the room to feel a little less empty, there is a subscribe button somewhere on this page, and I make a great deal of this kind of content. There's no pressure about it. I'm not going to ask you again. I'm not going to do the thing where I remind you every 20 minutes that you should be subscribing. If you find that you've drifted off 3 times in the same week with one of these on, that's probably your sign. And if not, the videos are not going anywhere. They will still be here. I will still be here, in the slightly bookish corner of the internet, talking quietly about made-up people as if they were real, because to me, in some important way, they are. All right. Let's go back. Let's go back further than you'd expect, because that's where the story actually starts, even if it isn't where Thanos technically enters it. A very long time ago, before there were people on Earth in any number worth mentioning, beings called the Celestials walked through the galaxy and conducted experiments on the species they found. The Celestials are enormous, more or less God-shaped, and they do not explain themselves. They arrive at a developing world, they reach down into the genetic material of whatever sentient species is rising on it, and they introduce 2 divergent strains. One strain they call the Eternals. The other strain they call the Deviants. The Eternals are stable, beautiful, long-lived, occasionally so long-lived that the word immortal stops being a metaphor. The Deviants are unstable, variable, monstrous in their variety, prone to producing throwbacks and mutations and strange divergent forms. And then the Celestials leave. They do not explain the experiment. They do not return for a very long time. The species they have altered are left to sort out, on their own, what has been done to them. The Celestials, as a concept, are one of Jack Kirby's great late-career contributions to the Marvel cosmos. He created them in 1976 in the original Eternals run, which ran for a year and a half before being folded back into the larger Marvel continuity. Kirby's idea, at root, was theological. He wanted to suggest, without ever saying it directly, that the gods of the various human mythologies might be echoes of an older, weirder set of beings who had visited the planet in deep prehistory and altered the species in ways that left fragmentary memories behind. The Celestials were those beings. They were not gods, exactly. They were the cosmic engineers whose visits, dimly remembered, had given rise to the language of gods. It is, as ideas in mainstream comics go, an enormous idea. Kirby ran with it. The Marvel cosmos, in its current shape, is partly built on the bones of what he set down in those issues. On Earth, this produced the Eternals and the Deviants and the baseline human population, which is the strand most of us are most familiar with. But the Celestials performed the same experiment in more than one place. They went to a moon of Saturn called Titan, in our own solar system, and they did it there too. They created an Eternals colony on Titan. The Titans, as they came to call themselves, were a quiet, philosophical people. They built a civilization on Titan that was, by most accounts, a kind of utopia. Beautiful architecture, long lifespans, advanced technology in service of contemplation rather than expansion. The Titans were not conquerors, they were thinkers. I want to spend a moment on the texture of that, because the films, for understandable reasons of pacing, never quite show you what Titan was supposed to have been, before Thanos ruined it. The comics, in scattered flashbacks across various Stalin runs, give you glimpses. Titan was a place of long evenings. The architecture was open. There were gardens that had been tended by single families for thousands of years. The Titans, with their long lifespans, had time. They had time to think about questions that mattered. They had time to grow individual relationships into the depth that beings with shorter lives rarely manage. They had time, even, to be bored, in the deep, productive way that only long-lived beings can be bored. The kind of boredom that pushes a civilization into philosophy and art and the careful arrangement of furniture. Titan was, by every available measure, the place a civilization eventually becomes, if it gets enough centuries to settle into itself. Alas was one of those thinkers. He was a younger member of the Titan Eternals, a scientist, the brother of the leader of the colony, and when his brother eventually destroyed himself and most of the colony in a moment of doomed philosophical desperation, Alas survived. He survived along with a small group of fellow Titans, and they began the long work of rebuilding what had been lost. Alas eventually took the name Mentor, because he saw himself as the new teacher of the new Titan, and he married a woman named Sui-san, and they had a son named Eros. The brother, by the way, the one who destroyed the colony before Alas rebuilt it, was named Sui-san's husband prior to Alas in some retellings, and in others he was a separate figure, and the comics, as is their habit, have not entirely resolved the inconsistency. What matters for our purposes is that Titan had, by the time of Thanos' birth, already gone through one near-extinction event, and was a civilization that knew, in its institutional memory, how fragile it was. Its second flowering, the one under Mentor's guidance, was by all accounts more careful than its first. The Titans had learned. They were trying to be wise. They were, in their way, succeeding. Eros was a beautiful child, bright-eyed, golden-skinned, the sort of son a rebuilt utopia is supposed to produce. Eros grew up to become Star Fox, and we will say very little about him tonight. except to note that he is part of the picture, and that he was the older brother, and that he was, by every measure, the easier child. We do not have time to do Star Fox justice, and frankly, the comics have struggled to do Star Fox justice for decades, so we will quietly leave him to the side. He matters mostly because of who came after him. The second son was different. I want to slow down here because this is the moment the whole story turns on, and the films tend to skip it entirely. When Sui-san was pregnant with her second child, something in the genetic material of the Titan colony surfaced that no one had expected. The deviant syndrome, as it came to be called in the comics, is a recessive trait, an echo of the divergent strain the Celestials had originally introduced alongside the Eternal one, and it occasionally surfaces in an Eternal child without warning. The second child was born showing the deviant syndrome in full. He was, by Eternal standards, monstrous. Purple skin, a heavy, ridged jaw, an enormous frame even as an infant. He did not look like his brother. He did not look like his mother. He did not look like anything that had been born on Titan in a very long time. In one of the better-known versions of the story, told most fully in Jason Aaron and Simone Bianchi's Thanos Rising in 2013, the moment Sui-san looks down at her newborn second son, she sees something in him that horrifies her. She tries to kill him. She is restrained. The child is taken away from her, raised at a slight distance, and Sui-san is afterward never entirely well again. There are other versions where the story is less violent and more sorrowful, but the core image is consistent across most of them. His mother looked at him and recoiled. He absorbed that look. He never put it down. His name was Thanos. The name comes from the Greek Thanatos, meaning death. His father, who named him, was a scholar, and would have known that whether Alaz chose the name as a private acknowledgement of the child's appearance, or as a kind of warding, or as an accident of taste, the comics have offered different answers in different decades. The thing that matters is what the name became inside the boy who carried it. Children generally grow into the names they are given. There is a small body of psychological literature on this, although the comics never reference it directly. A child whose parents have named him with a word that means death, and who has been told, gently or not, that the name was chosen because his appearance reminded the adults around him of something funereal, will eventually metabolize the name and the framing into a self-concept. He will become, over time, what the name said he was. He will, in subtler and subtler ways, organize his own behavior around the suggestion. Alaz, I think, did not mean to do that to him. Alaz was a scholar, and he loved his second son in the cautious, slightly bewildered way scholars love things they do not entirely understand. But the name was the name. The boy heard it every day. The boy looked in the mirror every morning. The boy understood, in the way children always understand things they are not formally told, that the adults around him had reached, when they named him, for the language of endings. Thanos grew up on a Titan that did not know what to do with him. The other children avoided him. He was larger than them, stronger than them, and he looked frightening even at rest. The Titan adults were kind in the careful, slightly performative way that adults often are with a child. They secretly find disturbing. He was given access to the best education the colony had to offer. He was loved by his father, in a slightly distant scholarly way. He was avoided by his mother. He was, almost from the beginning, alone with himself. His father, Mentor, who has appeared across many decades of comics in various supporting roles, is one of the more quietly tragic parents in the Marvel Universe. Although the comics have rarely centered him in the way I think he deserves. Mentor, when you look at his life as a whole, is a man who lost his older brother to a kind of philosophical madness, rebuilt a civilization from the ruins, married a woman he loved, had 2 sons, and then watched the younger son turn into the very thing his older brother had been afraid of. Mentor is, structurally, a father who failed. He failed not by being cruel, but by being too careful. He saw the strangeness in Thanos early. He could have intervened more, perhaps. He could have spoken with his son more directly about what was happening in the small notebooks. He could have done 100 small things differently. He did not, mostly because he was a scholar, and scholars often substitute careful observation for action. He observed. He took notes. He hoped the boy would grow out of it. The boy did not grow out of it. By the time Mentor understood that the situation was beyond his control, the situation was already, in fact, beyond his control. He spent the rest of his life living with that knowledge. The films do not include him. The films do not have time. But he is there, in the comics, a small grey figure at the edges of every Thanos story, holding the slow ache of a father who could have done more and did not. There is a sequence in Thanos Rising that I think about more often than I should. A very young Thanos, 8 or 9 years old, sits in a field with another child, a girl roughly his age, who is the only person on Titan who will speak to him. They are drawing in the dirt with a stick. Thanos draws a skull. The girl does not know what it is. Thanos cannot really explain what it is, except that he keeps drawing it, and he keeps drawing it, and eventually the girl gets up and leaves and never comes back. He is left alone in the field with the drawing. He stares at it for a long time. The Bianchi art in that sequence is doing very particular work. Simone Bianchi is one of the more painterly artists working in mainstream comics, and his Thanos Rising pages have a quality of light to them, a kind of soft Mediterranean afternoon glow that makes the horror of the underlying material land harder than it would in a more obviously grim style. The child in those panels does not look monstrous. He looks like a slightly larger than usual purple boy with sad eyes, drawing in the dirt with a stick. The girl beside him does not look frightened of him until the moment she sees what he is drawing. The transition, when it happens, is small. A slight withdrawal of her shoulder, a slight tilt of her head away from the picture, a slight rearrangement of her body to make herself, by degrees, ready to leave. Bianchi paints those small movements with the kind of attention most superhero artists reserve for action sequences. He is, in those pages, painting the precise moment a small social loneliness deepens into a larger, lifelong one. The drawing in the dirt is the cause. The girl's withdrawal is the effect. Thanos, watching her go, is the consequence of both. That image is, I think, the entire character in miniature. A child who's been left alone with a drawing he didn't entirely understand making, and who cannot stop returning to it. He is not yet a killer. He is not yet a conqueror. He is a small person discovering, by himself, that some part of him is drawn to a thing that the rest of his world is repulsed by, and that the world will not stay with him while he looks at it. Slightly later in his childhood, in the same arc, Thanos is befriended by a hooded figure who appears at the edges of his life. She is mysterious, watchful, never fully visible. She speaks to him in a voice no one else can hear. She is the only person who seems to find his interest in death not frightening, but interesting. The reader, of course, recognizes her immediately. She is Mistress Death, the cosmic personification of mortality in the Marvel Universe, and she has decided, for reasons of her own, to take a young Thanos as a kind of project. The child does not know who she is. The child only knows that someone, finally, is paying attention. This is the part of the story the films chose not to tell, and I want to flag as my first real opinion of the evening that I find the choice understandable, and also a quiet loss. The MQ's Thanos has a motivation that is, by design, abstracted and rationalized. He is a Malthusian. He believes in population balance. He believes resources cannot scale, and that mercy requires culling. It is a clean, elegant, intellectually defensible position, and it allowed Marcus and McFeely to write him as the kind of villain who could plausibly argue his case in front of an audience that has never picked up a comic. It worked. The film is better for the choice in many ways, but the comic's Thanos, the original Thanos, is not really an ideologue. He is a man in love. He is a man whose every massacre is, in the end, a flower laid at the feet of a personified force, who he believes is the only being in the universe who has ever truly seen him. That is a much stranger story. That is a sadder story. And I think the film, by removing Mistress Death from the equation, traded a piece of the character's interior weather for the sake of cleaner argument. I don't think it was the wrong trade. I just think it was a trade. We will come back to her, the hooded figure, the mistress. We will come back to her many times. She is the long shadow over everything Thanos does in the comics, and even when the MQ sidelines her, you can feel her absence in the shape of what's been left out. Back to the child. Thanos, as he grew into his early teens, began to do things he could not entirely explain to himself. He began to dissect small creatures. He began to keep notes. The notes were not the notes of a sadistic child enjoying himself. They were the notes of a researcher, careful and meticulous, trying to understand a thing that he could not look away from. The Titans, when they discovered the notebooks, were appalled in the way only a peaceful philosophical civilization can be appalled at the discovery that one of its children is keeping a private catalogue of small deaths. His father increased his supervision. His mother withdrew further. The hooded figure, in his dreams, told him to keep going. There is a scene, late in Thanos Rising, that I genuinely do not enjoy reading. I will use my one allowance of that word here, because it is the right word. I do not enjoy reading it. Thanos, now an adolescent, performs a kind of experiment on his own mother. He kills Sui-san, he tells himself, and the figure in the hood tells him that the experiment is necessary. He wants to see what is inside her. He wants to understand whether the part of her that recoiled from him at birth is something he can identify physically, in her brain, as a thing he could have cut out, perhaps, and made her love him. He does not say it that way. He says it in clinical language, scientific language, the language of a researcher. But that is what the act is, underneath. He is trying to find in his mother's body the place where her love for him failed to form, and he is trying to do it with a knife, because at 13 or 14 he has no other instrument available. It does not work. He does not find anything. His mother is dead. The figure in the hood is pleased. That moment, that single moment, is the hinge of the whole life. Everything Thanos does for the next several thousand years is, in some unspoken way, an attempt to repeat the experiment at larger and larger scales, and to receive at last the result he wanted from his mother. He is trying to kill enough things that the universe finally turns and looks at him the way she did not. He is trying, in essence, to be loved. He doesn't know that's what he is doing. He thinks he is in love with death and that he is courting her. But underneath the courtship is the dissection. Underneath the cosmic ambition is a child holding a notebook in a field. I want to sit with that, because it is the part of him that most discussions of him skip past. He is not a villain. He is not even, in the strict sense, evil. He is a deeply wounded boy who never recovered from his mother's first look, and who built, around that wound, the largest possible apparatus of pretended philosophical purpose, and who then walked through several galaxies acting it out. That is what Thanos is. The throne, the gauntlet, the army, the snap. All of it sits on top of a boy in a field with a stick and a drawing of a skull, and no friend left to ask him what it was. When he was old enough to leave Titan, he left. He was not exiled exactly. He went. The colony was relieved, although no one would have said so directly. He spent some years wandering the space lanes in a small ship, alone, encountering pirates and traders and strange beings on small worlds, killing some of them, sparing others, slowly accumulating the knowledge and the resources he would later need. He became, over the course of those years, very strong. He was already strong by virtue of being a deviant syndrome eternal, which is to say almost impossibly durable and powerful by baseline humanoid standards. But he augmented himself further. He experimented on his own body. He read everything he could find. He was throughout all of this in conversation with the figure in the hood, who he was now able to see more clearly, and who he understood by now to be Death herself, and who he was by then completely and uncomplicatedly in love with. The middle years of his wandering in the various comics that have filled in the gaps over the decades are sketched only in pieces. There are stories in which he raids small colonies. There are stories in which he negotiates with pirate kings. There is one quiet, lovely Stalin-drawn sequence from a much later one-shot in which a young Thanos meets a small group of mendicant philosophers on a backwater moon, eats with them at a fire, and listens to them debate the nature of cosmic balance. And we are made to understand that the philosophical scaffolding he will later use to justify his enormous violence is, in fact, borrowed almost wholesale from a few sentences a quiet old woman said to him over soup. He stays one night. He thanks them in the morning. He leaves. And then, decades later, in his own personal chronology, he will repeat the woman's argument to a stranger at the end of a galaxy as if it were his own, and the stranger will be unable to refute him, and the city will burn, and the woman who gave him the words will not, by then, even be a memory in his head. That is how he builds his ideology in the comics version of the character. He picks up small pieces from people he meets and forgets, and he stacks them into a tower large enough to justify what he has underneath, already decided to do. The ideology is the cover story. The decision is older than the ideology. Eventually, in a turn that the comics have told and retold across several different runs, Thanos returned to Titan. He returned with a fleet. He returned with weapons. He returned with a long, quiet rage at the place that had not been able to look at him properly. And he discharged that rage in a single brutal afternoon by destroying nearly all of it. The Titan colony, the philosophical eternal civilization his father had helped build, the gardens, the libraries, the small white domes in the dust, were rendered, in a few hours, into rubble and ash, the casualties numbered in the millions. His father escaped, by some accounts, or survived, depending on the continuity. The mother was already dead. The community that had been polite to him as a child, that had let him sit at the back of the room while the elders talked, was annihilated. The young man who had once dissected a small lizard in the field, looking for the place where love lived, returned to the field as a god in armor and erased the entire civilization that had built the field. The notebook had become a fleet. The experiment had grown. Thanos, after the destruction of Titan, became, in cosmic comics terms, a known quantity. He was not yet the universe-spanning threat he would later become, but the various star empires and council bodies of cosmic Marvel began to keep dossiers on him. The Kree noticed, the Skrulls noticed, the Shah Imperial Guard noticed. The various cosmic abstracts including eternity and the living tribunal and Lord Order and Master Chaos, began, in the way these beings begin things, to discuss him in their respective unfathomable councils. He was, by their standards, a new piece on a board they had been playing for a very long time. They began to plan around him. Some of them began, more pertinently, to plan against him. But none of them, in those early years, fully understood the shape of his project. They saw the conquest. They saw the violence. They did not see, because he did not advertise it, the love. The hooded figure in his dreams was not, then, a piece of cosmic intelligence anyone had compiled. She was his alone. The thing he was doing all this for was, by his own choice, a private matter. He did not want her seen. He did not want her shared. He kept her, in some psychological sense, locked in a small interior room, and he took her out only when he was alone, and he kissed her hand, in his head, and he went back out into the universe to bring her another planet. She was not in love with him. She is not in love with anyone. She is the personification of death, and personification, as a concept, does not include the kind of interiority that loves a particular person, but she allowed him to court her. She allowed him to believe she might one day return the affection. She allowed him to keep going, and he kept going. He raised an army. He raised it slowly, over years. He recruited mercenaries, killers, exiles, refugees, anyone who would take coin and ask few questions. He built ships. He acquired weapons. He learned how to move quietly through systems and how to strike before the local government could organize a response. He became, over time, one of the more efficient warlords any quadrant of the galaxy had ever seen. And then, when he had assembled enough force, he turned the army around and pointed it at the only place that mattered. He attacked Titan. I'm going to slow down again here, because the way most retellings handle this beat is, I think, slightly off. They make it sound like vengeance, or like a strategic move, or like the kind of grand gesture a comics villain makes to announce his arrival on the cosmic stage. It is none of those things, or it is all of them, and also more than any of them. It is a child going home to show his mother what he became, except his mother is already dead, by his own hand, and so what he is really doing is going home to show himself what he became, in the place that had refused to look at him. The attack on Titan, in the original Stalin telling, is brief and absolute. He does not lay siege. He does not negotiate. He bombards the colony from orbit with what amounts to a planetary-scale weapons platform of his own design, and he reduces the surface of Titan to ash and broken stone and a few scattered survivors. His father escapes. His brother is off-world at the time and survives. Most of the rest of the Titan population is killed. The civilization that had taken thousands of years to recover from his uncle's earlier catastrophe is, in a few hours, ended. He stands on the surface afterward, looking at what he has done, and there is no scene in any version of this story where he expresses regret. There is also no scene in any version of this story where he expresses joy. He looks at it, he registers it, and he moves on. The thing that is missing from him, the thing his mother saw at his birth and could not name, is by this point fully and visibly absent. He does not feel what other beings feel when they look at a dead world. He feels what he has always felt, which is the steady hum of his own purpose and the faint, approving silence of the figure in the hood. He went out into the galaxy after that, and he kept killing. He killed on different scales. He killed for different stated reasons. He killed sometimes because there was something he needed, and he killed sometimes because there was something he didn't want, and he killed sometimes for what he would have called principle, although the principle shifted depending on the decade and the writer. The numbers across the run of him in the comics get properly hard to track. Estimates have been put forward by characters within the Marvel Universe of trillions. The actual on-page death count of Thanos across his fictional life is, by any reasonable accounting, the largest of any single character in mainstream superhero comics. He has, by orders of magnitude, killed more people than any other named villain in the history of the medium. He has done it slowly, deliberately, and on purpose. And he has done it the whole time, for her. Let's go somewhere completely different for a moment. Let's talk about a place that exists, in the comics, at a level above the normal levels of reality, above the planets and the empires and the cosmic threats. There is a layer of the Marvel cosmos that is occupied by what the comics, with deliberate plainness, call the abstract entities. They are personifications. They are concept beings. They are, if you want to be technical about it, the named forces of the universe, taking shape as characters so that mortals have something to talk to when they need to talk to a concept directly. Death is one of them. Eternity is another. Infinity is another. Galactus, although he is sometimes counted as one of them, and sometimes counted as something else, is in their general vicinity. The living tribunal sits above them. The one above all sits above the living tribunal. And the one above all is, in the published on-the-page sense, God. Or more often, just an idea of God that Marvel allows itself to reference without ever drawing his face. These beings interact with each other in ways that are almost incomprehensible from a mortal frame. They are not exactly friends. They are not exactly enemies. They are aspects of a single architecture, and they spend long, slow eons negotiating their respective domains, and occasionally, when one of them becomes restless or unhappy, causing trouble down at the level of stars and planets, where mortals like us are running our small lives. Their existence raises, in passing, one of the more interesting theological questions any superhero comic line has ever proposed for itself, which is whether the Marvel Universe is ultimately an ordered cosmos or a chaotic one. The presence of the abstracts argues for order. The fact that things like death and time and eternity have faces, can be reasoned with, can be petitioned, suggests a universe whose fundamental forces are, at some level, persons. A universe of persons is a universe in which moral conversations can happen. A universe of impersonal forces is not. Marvel, in choosing to personify its abstracts, has implicitly committed itself to the first kind of universe, and this commitment has, across the decades, given its writers a particular kind of dramatic option that other cosmologies do not have. You can write a story in which a character argues, face to face, with the principle of mortality. You can have a person try to seduce, or trick, or outthink the basic operating concepts of the world they live in. That is a great deal of imaginative real estate, and Stalin, more than any other Marvel writer, has been the one to walk through it most thoroughly. Mistress Death, in particular, has a complicated history with the universe she presides over. She does not, in the comics, have many close relationships. She is rarely, if ever, fully social. She speaks, when she speaks, in single soft sentences. She is frequently drawn as a hooded figure in white robes, or as a robed skeleton, or, in some of the more striking Stalin renderings, as a slim figure whose face shifts between a beautiful young woman and a grinning skull, depending on the angle the reader is meant to be looking at her from. She is, to put it gently, not the easiest cosmic entity to have a relationship with. The visual ambiguity is intentional. Stalin has spoken in interviews about how he wanted Death to be a being who could be perceived differently by different observers, in keeping with how mortals themselves differ in how they think about mortality. Some see her as the beautiful young woman. Some see her as the skull. Most see her at different times as both, the way most people, over a lifetime, alternate between fearing death and being drawn toward it, sometimes within a single afternoon. Thanos, by Stalin's design, sees her almost always in her beautiful form. That is part of what makes the courtship so unsettling. He is in love with a being most other characters find unbearable to look at. He has, in a sense, fallen for the version of mortality that other people only see in their best moments. He sees her as desirable because he has spent his entire life conducting a private apprenticeship in finding the language of endings beautiful, and the apprenticeship has succeeded too well. Thanos, all the same, decided that he was going to have a relationship with her. He decided that he was going to court her formally and openly across the long timescales of his life, and that he was going to perform for her the largest possible displays of his power, in the hope that she would, eventually, turn her attention to him in the way he wanted her to. Most of his cosmic crimes, the ones we associate with the character, the ones that built his reputation, are gifts, not strategic objectives, not political moves, gifts. He kills planets the way another suitor might bring flowers. He kills civilizations the way a teenager might write a love song. There is a horrifying tenderness in it, and it is not, in the comics, hidden. It is right on the surface. He says it openly. He addresses her directly. He commits the killings in her name. The first major arc in which all of this comes to a head is the Captain Marvel run, issues 25 through 33, written and drawn by Jim Starlin in 1973 and 1974. Thanos at this point is still a relatively young character. He had been introduced in Iron Man number 55 in 1973 in a Starlin script, in a story that gave very little of his backstory and mostly established him as a large, frightening, purple-jawed warlord with cosmic ambitions. The Captain Marvel run is where he becomes the character we know. It is where the cosmic cube, an earlier reality-warping artifact that predates the Infinity Stones in publishing history, enters the Thanos story for the first time, and where he uses it, briefly, to ascend to something approaching godhood, before being defeated by the combined efforts of Captain Marvel, Mar-Vell, and a small handful of allies. Starlin's Thanos in those issues is already, even at the level of basic visual design, a quietly remarkable piece of comics work. Starlin has said in interviews across the years that he based the Thanos design partly on Metron of the New Gods, a character from Jack Kirby's Fourth World Comics over at the other big publisher, and partly on Darkseid, also from the Fourth World. His editor at Marvel, when Starlin first showed him the Thanos sketches, reportedly said something along the lines of, "You can do better," and pushed Starlin to make him bigger, more imposing, more visually distinctive. Starlin redrew him. He gave him the big jaw, the heavy build, the slightly unnatural proportions. The result is a character who looks immediately like nothing else in mainstream comics. He is recognizable in a single panel. That is, in the comics business, the entire game. The Captain Marvel arc ends with the cosmic cube being smashed, Thanos being defeated, and Mar-Vell being elevated, briefly, to a kind of cosmic awareness that the comics would carry forward in later issues until his death from cancer in 1982, which is one of the more quietly devastating long-form stories the Marvel Comics line has ever told. We will not be talking about Mar-Vell's death tonight, because it deserves its own video, and one day I'll make one. But that's where the arc lands, and that is the first time Thanos is properly humbled in print. I want to dwell on the Captain Marvel run for a moment longer than I might otherwise, because it is, in some sense, the foundational text of cosmic Marvel comics, and most people who only know Thanos from the films have never read it. And that is, in my view, a small loss. The art is, by modern standards, a little rough in places. The dialogue is, in places, on the dense and operatic side that 1970s Marvel comics tended toward, with characters explaining their inner states out loud at length. But underneath that surface, Stalin is doing a thing that comics had only rarely done up to that point, which is to take the cosmic scale fight seriously as a philosophical question, and not just as a fight. The issues are full of small interludes in which Thanos sits, alone, in a chamber, and meditates on his project. He talks to himself. He talks, in vision sequences, to the figure of death. He explains to himself and to her why what he is doing is, in his own twisted reading, the only reasonable response to the cosmic facts as he understands them. The comics, in those interludes, are working a register that the films, decades later, would adapt and simplify. The seed of every Brolin monologue is in those mid-70s Stalin pages. You can hear it if you read them. The cadence is the same. Marvel, in those issues, is a more complicated foil than the films have allowed his successor, Carol Danvers, to be. He is a Kree military officer by origin, who has been on Earth for some time, and who has begun to develop a private quarrel with his own people. He is, in narrative terms, an outsider hero in the older mode, a stranger learning to love the place he had been sent to conquer. When Thanos comes for the cosmic cube, Marvel is the hero the universe has, and he rises to meet him with a mix of physical courage and intellectual seriousness that the comics, before then, had rarely afforded a cosmic protagonist. The fight between them in the climactic issues is full of mid-air theological argument. They are not just punching, they are debating, in the air, what the universe is for. Stalin, on the page, lets them. He gives the fight long stretches of dialogue. He lets the philosophical content of the encounter be the main event, with the physical struggle as backdrop. It is, in the comics craft sense, a slightly mad way to construct a climactic battle. And it is, in retrospect, exactly the thing that made the run feel like something new. Stalin's Thanos in those issues is already, even at the level of basic visual design, a quietly remarkable piece of comics work. Stalin has said, in interviews across the years, that he based the Thanos design partly on Metron of the New Gods, a character from Jack Kirby's Fourth World comics over at the other big publisher, and partly on Darkseid, also from the Fourth World. His editor at Marvel, when Stalin first showed him the Thanos sketches, reportedly said something along the lines of, "You can do better," and pushed Stalin to make him bigger, more imposing, more visually distinctive. Stalin redrew him. He gave him the big jaw, the heavy build, the slightly unnatural proportions. The result is a character who looks, immediately, like nothing else in mainstream comics. He is recognizable in a single panel. That is, in the comics business, the entire game. He goes away for a while after that. He resurfaces. He gets killed. He comes back. The comics, in their 1970s and 1980s incarnations, are not as careful with their cosmic deaths as later decades would learn to be. And Thanos is, for several years, a kind of latent presence rather than an active threat. He waits, he plots, he thinks about her. And then, in 1990, Stalin brought him back in a serious way, in a 2-issue prologue called The Thanos Quest, and the year after that, in 1991, in the 6-issue series that would become, more than any other single comic, the defining Thanos story. the Infinity Gauntlet, drawn initially by George Perez, then finished by Ron Lim, and lettered with a careful, almost stately formality across all 6 issues. Stalin's name on the script, Perez and Lim on the art. I want to do this one slowly, because it is the spine of everything that follows. The premise of the Infinity Gauntlet is, in publishing terms, almost outrageous in its scope. The Mad Titan, working alone, has acquired the 6 Soul Gems, which were the comics era name for what the films would later call the Infinity Stones. He has acquired them in the Thanos quest, in a series of one-on-one encounters with the cosmic entities who held them, each encounter a small masterpiece of comics economy in its own right. He has then placed them into a golden gauntlet of his own design, which he wears on his left hand, and which channels their combined power. With the gauntlet on, he is, functionally, omnipotent. He can rewrite reality. He can be in every place at once. He can think every thought at once. He has, in a single act of acquisition, made himself the most powerful being who has ever existed in the published Marvel Universe. And he has done it, again for her. The whole point of the gauntlet, in the story, is to win Death's love. I should pause and say something about Thanos Quest itself, because it is, structurally, one of the more elegant prologue stories in mainstream cosmic comics, and it tends to be under-discussed because it sits in the shadow of the larger series that follows it. The Thanos Quest is, essentially, 6 small heist stories in a row, each one in which Thanos confronts a different cosmic being who holds one of the 6 gems, and each one in which he extracts the gem through a different combination of cunning, leverage, and brute force. The gem holders in the original 1990 telling are a collection of cosmic beings whose names will mean something to long-time comics readers and very little to anyone else. The In-Betweener, the Champion of the Universe, the Grandmaster, the Collector, the Runner, the Gardener. They are, collectively, the Elders of the Universe, a group of immensely old beings who have, across deep time, each developed an obsession with one particular activity, and who carry the gems as personal artifacts of their respective obsessions. Thanos beats them, one at a time, by understanding the obsession better than they do. The champion lives for combat, so Thanos goads him into a fight that the champion cannot win without breaking his own combat code. The collector lives for acquisition, so Thanos offers him a thing that is impossible to acquire and watches him fail to resist. Each encounter is, in miniature, a study in how an obsession becomes a vulnerability when an opponent who is not obsessed in the same direction comes to play. The Elders, having spent their lives pursuing one thing, are blind to everything else. Thanos has spent his life pursuing one thing too, but his thing is so different from any of theirs that he can see them clearly, and they cannot see him. He takes the gems, 6 of them, one by one. He wears the gauntlet. He moves on. The quest ends. The gauntlet begins. The Gardener encounter, in particular, has always struck me as the small jewel of the quest. The Gardener, in the comics, is an old being whose obsession is the cultivation of plants. He travels from world to world tending gardens. His gem is the time gem, which he uses, in his own quiet way, to make his plants grow faster, to extend their seasons, to keep them blooming through what would otherwise be their winters. He is, of all the Elders, the gentlest. He carries no army. He commands no fleet. He simply gardens. When Thanos arrives in his garden, the Gardener does not, at first, see him as an enemy. He offers him a tour. He shows him the rare flowers. He explains, with the slightly distracted pleasure of an old man, who does not get many visitors, what each species needs to thrive. Thanos listens. The reader, by then, knows what is going to happen. 2. The gardener does not. The moment Thanos turns on him is brief, and Stalin draws it with great economy. The gardener does not understand, in those final panels, what is happening to him. He has spent so many millennia tending small green things that he has, in some deep sense, lost the capacity to recognize what a being like Thanos actually is. He thinks, until almost the last second, that they are having a conversation about flowers. Thanos kills him. He takes the time gem. He walks out of the garden, and the garden, behind him, begins slowly to die. There is a single, wordless panel of dying flowers. It is one of the saddest single panels in cosmic Marvel comics, and most readers, in my experience, do not remember it because it is small and tucked between two larger set pieces. But it is there. The garden dies, off panel, because the gardener is dead, because Thanos came to call. That sequence is, I think, the quest in miniature. The Mad Titan is not, in those stories, doing his work against opponents who are, in any reasonable sense, equipped to oppose him. He is killing old, distracted, single-minded beings who have spent their lives tending their own narrow interests and who never developed the framework to recognize the predator standing in their respective doorways. The elders are not the cosmic council. They are the cosmic eccentrics. They have been allowed by the larger powers of the universe to do their own quiet things for an enormous amount of time, and the gems they carry are, in effect, family heirlooms rather than weapons. Thanos arrives, and he takes them, and the universe, in those first 2 issues, does not yet know what has been lost. The elders are dead. The gems are gone. The gauntlet is being assembled, and the larger cosmic council, when it finally turns its attention to the situation, will discover that all of the keys have already moved. His first major act with the completed gauntlet, in the 2nd issue of the series, is to snap his fingers and erase half of all life in the universe. I want you to sit with the fact that the snap, the moment that the films would later build their entire culminating event around, was originally written by Jim Starlin in 1991 as a single gesture in the middle of a comic, performed by Thanos as a love offering. He does it on the page. He raises his hand. He snaps, and half of every living thing in the universe, including most of the named heroes the reader has been following for years, ceases to exist. The comic does not show all the deaths. It cannot show all the deaths. It shows a few, in carefully chosen vignettes, and it lets the implication do the rest. The Prez art in those panels is some of the best work of his career. He had drawn Crisis on Infinite Earths over at the other publisher, just a few years earlier, and he brought the same sense of cosmic mass death pageantry to the Marvel side. There are panels in Infinity Gauntlet number 2 where you can feel the weight of the disappearances even though you are only being shown 3 or 4 faces. The structure of the rest of the series, in broad strokes, is a slow build to a confrontation between Thanos with the completed gauntlet and an alliance of surviving heroes, plus a slightly improbable coalition of cosmic entities, with Adam Warlock as the strategic mind organizing the resistance. The hero side of the conflict is, in publishing terms, a kind of all-hands gathering of the few major Marvel characters who were not erased by the snap, plus an even more improbable contingent of cosmic forces who realize, in the aftermath of the snap, that Thanos has now become a threat to the structural integrity of reality itself, and that he must accordingly be opposed even by entities who would not normally bother themselves with the affairs of a single mortal. The big fights happen in the 4th and 5th issues. Spider-Man, Captain America, the Hulk, Thor, Doctor Doom, Doctor Strange, the Silver Surfer, and a small handful of others charge the Mad Titan in a series of waves, and Thanos, with the gauntlet, dispatches them one at a time. He does it with a kind of slow contempt. He does not even, in most cases, treat them as serious opponents. He is functionally a god, and they are mortal heroes, and the imbalance is on the page in every panel. Prez and Lim, between them, draw the encounters with a great deal of dignity. They give each hero their moment. They give each hero their loss. It is one of the few mainstream comics events that handles the structural problem of a god-tier villain by leaning into the imbalance rather than away from it. The heroes do not have a chance. The reader understands that they do not have a chance. The point of their charge is not to win. The point is to delay. They are buying Adam Warlock time, although they do not entirely know it. They are buying the cosmic order time to assemble its actual response. That response, when it comes, is one of the stranger things in mainstream 1990s comics. The cosmic abstracts themselves, the personifications of eternity and infinity, and the various other named forces of the universe descend on Thanos en masse. They fight him collectively. He, with the gauntlet, fights them back, and in the course of the fight, something happens that the comic, to its credit, lets the reader figure out without explaining it directly. Thanos, in order to win the fight against the cosmic abstracts, has to leave his body. He has to ascend, briefly, to their plane of reality and engage with them on their own terms. He does this. He defeats them. He is in that moment the most powerful being in the universe by a margin that is no longer measurable. And in becoming that, he leaves his body behind, sitting on the cosmic throne, with the gauntlet on its inert hand. Nebula, who has been observing from the sidelines, suspended in a kind of half-life of her own making after an earlier encounter, takes her opportunity. She crawls forward. She slides the gauntlet off the unguarded hand of her grandfather's body. She puts it on. And the comic, with a beautifully composed sequence of panels, transfers the omnipotence from Thanos to Nebula in real time, while Thanos off in the cosmic abstract plane has no idea what has just happened on the physical level he is supposed to be defending. What follows is a small wonder of plotting. Adam Warlock, having anticipated the possibility, talks Nebula through her first moments of having the gauntlet, and asks her to undo Thanos' snap as her first act, on the grounds that returning the universe to its previous state will buy time and confuse the powers arrayed on either side. Nebula, who is petty and damaged in the specific way her grandfather made her, agrees, mostly because returning the universe to the way it was hurts Thanos personally. She undoes the snap. The disappeared heroes return. The cosmic balance briefly reasserts itself. Thanos, becoming aware of what has happened, returns to his body and finds the gauntlet gone, the snap reversed, and his granddaughter sitting on his own throne in his own gauntlet, doing exactly the things he has spent the entire series doing. There is a sequence later in the series, after his subsequent ascension to a state in which he becomes, briefly, the universe itself, where Thanos realizes, with a slow dawning horror, that the more powerful he becomes, the further from her he gets. As long as he was a mortal with cosmic ambition, she could, in theory, be courted, because they existed on adjacent planes of reality, and could at least be in the same room. Once he becomes a universal force in his own right, he is on her plane, and on her plane the rules of courtship no longer apply. She does not love peers. She loves nothing. She simply is what she is. By making himself her equal, he has made it impossible for her to ever have him in the way he wanted to be had. The gauntlet, the snap, the ascension, all of it has put her permanently out of reach. This is, to my eye, one of the most quietly tragic moments in Marvel Comics. Thanos realizes, in slow motion, on the page, that he has destroyed his own goal in the act of pursuing it. He has won, in the technical sense, every battle. He holds the gauntlet. He has performed the offering. He has reshaped the universe. And in doing so, he has built, around himself, the perfect prisoner. He is now too powerful to be loved by the only being he ever wanted to be loved by, because that being only loves mortals, by virtue of being death. He drops the gauntlet in the end. He is tricked out of it technically by Nebula, who we have just talked about, but the real reason he loses it is that he no longer fully wants it. He has understood, in some deep part of himself, what he has done to his own desire. The villains of his level rarely understand themselves with that clarity. He does. He surrenders partly before the comic is even over, and he retires after the series ends to a small farm on an unnamed planet where he grows vegetables and reads books and is left more or less alone by the universe he had nearly destroyed. There are sequels, there are returns, the peace does not last. But that ending, that small final image of the Mad Titan tending his garden, is one of the most beautiful endings any villain has ever been given in mainstream comics, and Stalin, by all accounts, fought hard to keep it on the page. Good for him. It deserved to stay. There is one more thing about the gauntlet I want to mention before we move on. Across the series, Thanos has a recurring conversation with a small green-skinned trollish figure called Pip, who is one of Adam Warlock's old companions, and who functions in the larger Stalin cosmic mythology as a kind of comic relief character who turns out, at unexpected moments, to be more morally serious than the cosmic giants around him. Pip is in the gauntlet only briefly, but his presence is one of the small grace notes of the series. He represents, in his small drunken way, the ordinary lives that Thanos' snap has erased and restored. The lives that do not have throne rooms or cosmic powers, but that nonetheless count. Stalin uses him sparingly. He does not press the point. But Pip is there. He is the small figure on the edge of the page who reminds the reader, when the cosmic abstracts are descending and the gauntlet is glowing, that the entire purpose of the universe at the end of the day is to make room for ordinary lives. Thanos has forgotten this. Pip has not. Pip never could. Now, let's go somewhere a bit closer to home. Let's talk about the children. Because Thanos, in addition to the cosmic ambition and the courtship of death, has, across the comics and the films, accumulated a kind of family of inheritors and adoptees and tools. And that family is one of the more interesting things about him, and one of the places where the films, in fact, did very well by him. The films named them, in the Russos' hands, the Children of Thanos. The comics, more grandly, call them the Black Order. There are slight differences in roster, slight differences in characterization, but the broad strokes are similar enough that we can talk about them in one go. The Black Order, in the comics, was a Jonathan Hickman invention from his Infinity event in 2013, and Hickman, as a writer, has a particular gift for taking secondary villains and giving them just enough personality and just enough thematic role that they feel like proper characters rather than henchmen. The Order, as Hickman wrote them, were Thanos' elite enforcers, a small council of named warriors, each of them a master of a different battlefield discipline, each of them devoted in their respective ways to the Mad Titan. Ebony Maw was the orator, the diplomat, the manipulator, a thin, almost spectral figure with a long face and longer hands, whose specialty was not violence directly, but the placement of words inside other beings' minds. He could persuade, he could undermine, he could, with enough time, talk almost anyone into almost anything, and he reported back to Thanos with a kind of devotional pleasure. In the comics, his role with Thanos is complicated by the fact that he is, in fact, loyal to no one but himself, and he uses the position to advance schemes of his own. In the films, the loyalty is played straighter, and Tom Vaughan Lawler's performance, especially in his early Infinity War scenes, gives Maw a small, satisfied smile that does most of the character work in a few seconds. You can see in that smile a being who is, in some odd way, in love with the act of speaking on behalf of his master. He is a herald, in the medieval sense. He glories in the role. Proxima Midnight was the warrior, a tall, lean, blue-skinned woman in dark armor, carrying a long spear that, when she threw it, returned to her hand. She was, in the comics, the wife of Corvus Glaive, and the two of them functioned as a pair across most of their appearances. She is the most straightforward fighter of the group, and the one whose loyalty to Thanos is least complicated. She's in it because she likes the work. She likes the conquest. The films keep her, mostly, in that frame. Corvus Glaive, her husband, was the strategist and the executioner. He carried a glaive that, in the comics, made him essentially unkillable as long as it remained intact. He was, of the group, the one with the most direct connection to Thanos' larger plans, and the one most often seen in the position of right hand. In Infinity War, his death sequence in Wakanda is one of the small grace notes of the film. Vision turns the glaive on him at the last moment. It happens quickly. It happens almost off camera, and you can feel, in the seconds before it, that Glaive understands what has just been done to him, and that he accepts it, in the way that a long-time soldier in service of a long-time cause accepts the eventual cost. He does not beg. He does not bargain. He goes. Cull Obsidian, in the films, was the brute, the largest of them, the mute, the one with the heavy weapons. In the comics, he had been called Black Dwarf, which is a slightly more dignified name and one I prefer, but the films changed it to Cull Obsidian, which is also fine. He served the function of the group's heavy hitter, the one you sent in when the situation required mass and impact, and very little subtlety. He died, in Infinity War, off in a corner of the Wakanda battle, almost incidentally. The films do not give him much. The comics, frankly, do not give him much either. He is a piece on the board, mostly. Supergiant, the fifth member in the comics version, the one the films left out, was a kind of psychic vampire, a telepath who consumed the minds of those she defeated, growing more powerful and more unstable as she went. She had a complicated arc across the Hickman run, and she did not survive it, and the films, who already had a great deal to fit into Infinity War, were probably right to set her aside, though I wish she had been in there somewhere. Hickman's writing of her was strange and slightly dreamlike, and she would have given the order a slightly different texture if she had been included. And then there are the daughters. I want to be careful here, because Gamora and Nebula are not, properly speaking, members of the Black Order, even though they are sometimes folded into that grouping in popular memory. They are Thanos' adopted daughters, which is the term the comics use and the films use, although the term itself sits uncomfortably with the reality of what he did to them and how. They were taken, when they were very young, from their respective home planets, in raids that Thanos personally led, and they were raised, if that word even applies, by Thanos as part of a long, deliberate program of conditioning and training and pain that produced two of the most capable warriors in the galaxy, and that also produced two of the most damaged people in any version of the Marvel Universe. Gamora's home planet, the Zen-Hubari, was a small civilization that Thanos' forces destroyed almost entirely. She was the last survivor of her people. She was, at the time of the raid, a small child. Thanos found her in the rubble, decided he liked something about her, and took her with him. He raised her alongside his other adopted children. He trained her. He augmented her. He used the available alien technologies of the cosmos to make her, by the time she reached adulthood, into a being capable of killing nearly anything she encountered. She was called, in the comics and the films, the deadliest woman in the galaxy. That title was earned. It was also, in some important sense, given. Thanos gave it to her by making her into what she became. She did not, at any point in her childhood, have a choice about any of this. The comics are slightly more direct about that than the films are. The comics show, in flashback after flashback, a small Gamora being trained, being broken, being put back together in slightly different shape, being told that the love of her adoptive father depended on her capacity to do violence for him. She loved him, in the way a child loves the only parent available to it, no matter what that parent is doing. And she also, slowly, over the course of years, began to understand that the love she felt for him was not the same shape as the love a child should feel for a parent, and that the parent she had was not the parent she had needed. By the time she was an adult, she was already, in her quiet way, planning to leave. Nebula was a different story, and her story is, in some ways, the sadder of the two. Nebula was also taken young. She was also trained. She was also augmented. The difference, in her case, was that she was never the favorite. Thanos pitted his daughters against each other from very early on, in formal combat trials, in tests of skill, in the small daily humiliations that long-term abusers know how to deploy. Gamora won, every time. And every time Nebula lost, Thanos would take a piece of her and replace it with cybernetic equivalent, in a process he framed as improvement, but which was, in practice, the slow surgical erasure of her body in favor of machine. By the time she reached adulthood, she was barely organic anymore. Most of her was metal. Most of her was the cumulative result of every fight she had failed to win against her sister, which is to say, of every failure to earn her father's love. I want to sit with that mechanism for a moment, because it is one of the most concentrated images of abuse the comics have ever produced, even though the comics themselves do not always handle it with the care it deserves. The mechanism is this. A father takes two daughters. He makes them fight each other. He punishes the loser by replacing pieces of the loser's body. The loser, accordingly, has every incentive to win, because each loss costs her an organ. The winner, accordingly, has every incentive to win every time, because the alternative is watching her sister be dismantled in front of her. The result, over years, is that both daughters develop, simultaneously, a deep love of each other and a deep resentment of each other, plus a horror of their father that they cannot quite bring themselves to act on because their father is also, in their warped childhood, the only adult who paid attention to them. The whole thing is a textbook for how to ruin two children at once, and the cumulative effect, by the time both of them are adults, is two warriors who are immensely skilled, deeply damaged, and structurally incapable of trusting anyone, including each other, until something very specific shifts in their lives to break the pattern. That breaking, in the films, takes nearly the whole arc to accomplish. The first Guardians film in 2014 has Gamora and Nebula on opposite sides of a battle, with Nebula serving the larger antagonist force, Ronan, and Gamora having defected from her father's service. The two of them fight directly in the climactic sequence. Nebula loses, again, in the family pattern that has always defined her, and escapes off-camera at the end, broken but alive. The second Guardians film, in 2017, brings them together again under conditions that finally allow them to talk, briefly, about what was done to them. There is a sequence in that film, on the planet Ego, where the two of them have a small conversation in which Nebula describes the limb replacement procedure directly, in flat language, and Gamora hears it for what it is for perhaps the first time. The scene is small. The film does not press it, but it shifts something between the two of them. By the end of the second film, they are not exactly reconciled. They are, however, looking at each other as fellow survivors, rather than as rivals. The comics version of Nebula was, for a long time, a fairly minor villain. She appeared, she fought the Avengers, she lost, she escaped. The films took her in Karen Gillan's performance and turned her into something far more interesting. The first Guardians of the Galaxy film, in 2014, gave her one scene in particular, in which she pulls a cybernetic limb from her own arm to escape a binding that did more for the character in 20 seconds than any of her comics appearances had managed in decades. The way Gillan plays the moment, the slight grunt, the matter-of-fact reattachment, the immediate transition to the next thing, tells you everything you need to know about a person whose body is no longer entirely her own, and who has had to make peace with that by treating it as inventory rather than self. It is one of the small, unflashy character moments in those films that I think about a lot. The deeper genius of Gillan's performance, across all of her appearances, is that she does not play Nebula as bitter. She plays her as practical. There is a difference. A bitter character would chew the scenery. Gillan's Nebula does not chew anything. She measures, she calculates, she decides what is in front of her, and she handles it, and she moves on. The bitterness is there underneath, but it is not the surface. The surface is competence. The surface is the calm of a person who has, by long practice, learned to operate her own damaged body without complaint. When she finally does, in Endgame, allow herself a moment of warmth toward her sister, the moment lands harder than it would have if she had been playing the rest of the role as a wound. She is not a wound. She is a person who has spent a long time managing one. The films, by trusting Gillan to give them that distinction, ended up with one of the strongest character arcs in the entire franchise. Gamora and Nebula together, across the films, form the emotional center of the Thanos story. Their relationship with each other is the most carefully drawn relationship in the entire arc. They have, between them, almost every kind of difficult sibling dynamic available to fiction. They have rivalry and resentment, and the slow, late-arriving love of two adults who have realized, finally, that the person who set them against each other was the problem all along. The scene in Avengers Endgame in which past Nebula and present Nebula confront each other on the spaceship is, to my mind, one of the most psychologically rich scenes the film's ever produced. A character meeting her younger, more damaged self and trying, in real time, to talk her into a different future. It works because of years of careful character work across multiple films. It works because Gillan, in both halves of the performance, makes the two versions of Nebula look like the same person at different points in her recovery. There is a small detail in the second Guardians film, the one set on Ego's planet, that I want to point at, because I think it does more work than it is given credit for. Nebula, after she and Gamora have come to a partial reconciliation, says quietly that she does not, in fact, hate her sister. She says that what she always wanted was simply a sister. She had wanted a person on her side in the long years of her childhood, and Gamora had been the only candidate for the role, and the role had been corrupted by Thanos before it ever had a chance to become what it should have been. The line is delivered without flourish. Gillan does not push it. She lets it sit, and in that one sentence, the entire trajectory of Nebula's life becomes legible. She did not want power. She did not want her father's approval. She wanted a sister, and her father systematically prevented her from having one. The cybernetic limbs, the failed fights, the bitterness, the long resentment, all of it is the wreckage of a sister need that was deliberately broken in childhood by an adult who could not allow either daughter to have anyone but him. It is, on rewatch, one of the most quietly devastating character revelations the MCU has produced. The Gamora story, the larger Gamora arc across the films, ends in a place I have considerable difficulty with, and I want to mark this as my second real opinion of the evening. The Vormir sequence in Infinity War, in which Thanos sacrifices Gamora to obtain the Soul Stone, is filmed beautifully. The performances are exact. Brolin in particular does work in that scene that he was not, by reputation, expected to be able to do, and the small tear running down his cheek as he turns to push her over the edge is one of the most quietly debated images in the franchise, because it asks the audience to decide whether the tear is real, whether the love it implies is real, whether a man like Thanos is capable of the feeling the tear seems to claim. I think the scene is excellent. I think Zoe Saldana, throughout it, is as good as she has ever been in the role. And I also think the resolution of the larger Gamora arc in Endgame, where the version of Gamora we end up with is the past self version pulled forward in time, with none of the years of growth and reconciliation with Quill and the rest of the Guardians inside her, is a choice I have never been entirely able to make peace with. The films lost a Gamora, and the Gamora they gave us back is, in some important sense, not the same person. I understand why they did it. I understand the constraints of the script and the timeline and what they needed for Endgame to land. But there is, for me, a small permanent ache in the part of the franchise where the real Gamora used to be. They did not give her back. They gave her sister back what looked like her, and the difference matters. All right, let's slow down for a moment. We have been moving through a lot of material, and I want to give the listener room to settle. If you're still with me, hello. If you've drifted off in the last 20 minutes, that's quite all right. You can find us again whenever you wake up, or you can let the rest play through and pick it up tomorrow night. The story is still going. It will keep going for some time yet. Let me tell you about the comics from the 90s and the 2000s and the 2010s, because between the original Infinity Gauntlet and the films, there was a long, productive period in which various writers came back to Thanos and tried to do something with him that went beyond the courtship of death and the cosmic accumulation of power. Not all of these attempts worked. Some of them worked very well. The good ones did the thing I always want comics villains to do, which is to find a new shape inside an old character and to make the new shape feel like it had been there all along. In the early 1990s, immediately after Infinity Gauntlet, Starlin wrote 2 follow-up series, Infinity War in 1992 and Infinity Crusade in 1993. Both of these involved alternate or split versions of the cosmic order being thrown into conflict with the main Marvel universe, and Thanos, in both, played a slightly unusual role for him. He was on the side of the heroes, or more precisely, he was on the side of the universe as it currently stood, against threats that he, the Mad Titan, considered too disruptive to be permitted. There is a strange comedy in this when you sit with it. The most famous mass murderer in the Marvel cosmos becomes, in the early 90s, a recurring strategic ally of the Avengers and the various cosmic teams, on the grounds that he, of all people, has a stake in not letting the universe be unmade by someone less careful. It says something about how Starlin understood the character. Thanos is not, by Starlin's lights, a chaos agent. He is a Malthusian, or a death courtier, or whatever else you want to call him in a given year. but he believes in the universe as a structure. He doesn't want it broken. He wants it pruned. There is a difference, and the 90s Stalin runs leaned into the difference hard. Through the late 90s and early 2000s, Thanos was used somewhat sparingly. He appeared in cosmic events. He had a few solo miniseries of mixed quality. There was a Thanos ongoing in 2003 by Stalin and various artists, which ran for a year and a half and produced some interesting standalone stories. And then there was a longer fallow period in which the character was, for the most part, kept off the board. The next great Thanos era, for my money, was Jonathan Hickman's Infinity event in 2013, which I touched on earlier when we were talking about the Black Order. Hickman is a writer who likes to operate at the scale of empire and species and millennia, and he was, in retrospect, almost ideally suited to take Thanos on. His version of Thanos kept most of the Stalin foundations in place. The Mad Titan still had his history. He still had Mistress Death somewhere in his past. But Hickman pulled the focus slightly, away from the courtship of death engine, and towards something more political. His Thanos was an emperor. His Thanos had armies, fleets, vassal worlds, a long-term project of bringing certain selected civilizations to heel for reasons of his own. The Infinity event itself was a kind of two-front war. The Avengers fighting an external cosmic threat off-planet, while Thanos and his order quietly invaded Earth during the absence. It was a good piece of comic book chess, structurally, and Hickman, in the way he wrote Thanos' dialogue, managed to make him sound for the first time in a while like the kind of being who could plausibly run a galactic-scale political machine. He was less of a lover in Hickman's hands and more of a CEO. I do not think this fully replaced the Stalin version, but it added a layer. Hickman's larger contribution to the cosmic side of Marvel, beyond Infinity itself, was to construct a long, slow narrative architecture around the concept of the incursions, which were collisions between alternate universes that would, in the larger Hickman cosmology, eventually destroy the entire multiverse if not stopped. Thanos, in the unfolding of that larger story, was a piece on the board, not the main piece, but a major one. The Hickman cosmic mythology is dense, even by his own standards, and unpacking it fully would take its own video. What matters for our purposes tonight is that Hickman saw in Thanos a tool he could use to make certain kinds of structural arguments about empire and inheritance, and he used the tool with care. The result was a Thanos who felt, at last, like a being who had been running a large political organization for thousands of years and had the bureaucratic chops to show for it. He gave orders. People followed them. The cosmic scale of the operation finally made organizational sense, in a way that earlier writers had often gestured at, but never quite filled in. Inside the Hickman Infinity event, there was also a subplot involving Thanos' son, which is a thing the comics had touched on before, but which Hickman put at the center. Thanos, across his long life, has fathered or quasi-fathered a number of beings in addition to his adopted daughters, and one of them, in particular, a half-inhuman young man named Thane, became important in Hickman's run. Thane was the son Thanos did not raise. Thane discovered his powers, terrible powers, in a sequence of horror around an inhuman village. The plot mechanics here are involved, and I'm going to skip past most of them. But the emotional core of the Hickman version is that Thanos invades Earth, in significant part, in order to find and kill the prophesied child of his own loins, because he understands, in a way only a man with his history could understand, that the only being capable of finally ending him is the son he never met. It is structurally a very old story. Old. The father, terrified of being supplanted, going out to kill the prophesied successor. It is also a story that maps, eerily well, onto the rest of Thanos' life. Of course he kills his children. Of course he has always killed his children in one form or another, in one performance of love or another. Of course the son he never knew is the one he is most afraid of. The unconscious of the character writes itself. Hickman ended that arc more or less, with Thane trapping Thanos in a kind of suspended animation amber state, leaving the mad titan frozen, half conscious, half aware, for an extended period. It was a slightly elliptical ending, and other writers picked up the threads afterward, but the image of Thanos standing motionless in his amber prison, eyes open, mind running, body unable to move, is one of the more haunting Thanos images of the modern era. He had finally been put in a cage that fit his shape. He could see out. He could think. He could plan. He simply could not move, which is, in a way, the underlying condition of his whole life. He has always been a being who can see everything he wants and cannot quite reach it. Then comes Donny Cates and Jeff Shaw. 2017. The series simply called Thanos, with the King Thanos arc as the centerpiece. I want to spend a little time here, because this is the most interesting Thanos comic of the last decade and one of the most interesting Thanos comics ever. And it is also one of the most overlooked, because it ran in the slightly inconvenient window just before Infinity War hit cinemas, and reset what most people thought of when they thought of Thanos. The premise of the Cates run, simplified, is this. The current-day Thanos, the Thanos we are used to, is suddenly snatched out of his timeline by a future version of himself, the so-called King Thanos, who exists at the end of the universe alone, having outlived every other being in creation. King Thanos is enormously old. He is half machine. He sits on a throne made of bones in a dead universe with nothing around him but the cooling remnants of stars. He has, by this point, finally won death's love, in the sense that there is nothing left to die, and the entire universe is, in a sense, death herself. He has accomplished the thing he wanted to accomplish. He has paid the price the comic suggested he would have to pay. And he is, by every available measure, the loneliest being who has ever existed. The Jeff Shaw art across the Cates run deserves special attention. Shaw, as an artist, has a slightly rougher, slightly more brutal line than Perez or Bianchi, or the other Thanos artists of earlier eras, and he uses that line to do things that more polished artists could not have pulled off. His King Thanos in particular, the old man version, is one of the great pieces of comics character design of the last 15 years. The face is sunken, the eyes are tired, the body is half prosthetic, but the prosthetics look like they were assembled out of necessity over centuries, not engineered in a single design pass. He looks like what he is, which is a being who has been alive for far longer than was good for him, and who has, across the centuries, kept patching himself together with whatever was available, until what is left is half a god and half a salvage yard, both at once. The visual storytelling alone in those panels would justify the run. The script, fortunately, lives up to the art. He brings his younger self forward in time to assist him with one final task, the killing of a being called the Fallen One, who is the last surviving threat in the dead universe, and the bulk of the series is the two Thanoses, the present-day Mad Titan and the King at the end of time, working together and quietly antagonizing each other across the long, empty plains of the dying cosmos. Cates writes the dialogue between them as a kind of bitter philosophical comedy. The younger Thanos cannot stand the older one. The older one cannot stand the younger one. They are, of course, the same person at different points on the same trajectory. Each of them sees in the other the thing about himself he most despises. And each of them is right. The thing that makes the dialogue work, that makes you feel the bite of it as a reader, is that Cates writes each Thanos as if he is, individually, the kind of being who is almost incapable of admitting an error to himself, let alone to another version of himself. The two of them spar verbally throughout the entire series, and neither of them concedes a single point, and yet the cumulative effect of the conversation is that the reader can see, with great clarity, that both of them are wrong about almost everything they believe, and that the way each of them is wrong is, in fact, the explanation for why their lives have ended up where they have ended up. They are showing each other their own blind spots. They are refusing to learn anything from it. They are continuing, even at the end of the universe, to perform the same patterns of denial that they performed at the beginning. The comic is, in its way, a study in how character is destiny, and how no amount of cosmic travel, even time travel between versions of the self, will overcome a structural unwillingness to admit one is wrong. Riding along with them, in one of the great recent comics character introductions, is the cosmic Ghost Rider, who is, and I want to ask you to take a long, slow breath here, the future version of Frank Castle, the Punisher, who in this timeline died on Earth during the original Thanos invasion, went to Hell, was made into the new Ghost Rider, escaped from Hell, was found by Galactus, was made Galactus's herald, and eventually became a servant of Thanos in the long centuries leading up to the death of the universe. He carries a chain of cosmic fire. He rides a flaming motorcycle through deep space. He talks like the Punisher always talked, which is to say, with a kind of grim, flat humor. Except now, he is also a being of cosmic flame on a horse made of stars. It is, by any reasonable standard, one of the most absurd character concepts in the history of mainstream comics. And in Cates and Shaw's hands, it works. It works because they commit to it. They take the absurdity seriously. They give Cosmic Ghost Rider real interiority, real grief, a real arc, a real relationship with the Thanoses he serves. He is not played as a joke. He is played as a man at the end of a very long road, who has nothing left except a sense of mission, and who is wound up by sheer survival, sitting next to the most powerful being who ever lived. There is a sequence midway through the run in which Cosmic Ghost Rider tells the younger Thanos, plainly and without flourish, about his daughter, about the Punisher's family, about the thing that started him on the long road that ended with him sitting on a flaming motorcycle next to the Mad Titan at the end of time. Younger Thanos listens. He does not interrupt. He does not even, at the end, mock the story. He simply receives it. The reader can see, in the way Shaw draws him in those panels, that something in him recognizes the shape of what Frank is describing. Both of them are men whose lives were organized, irrevocably, by a wound they could not undo. Both of them have spent the rest of those lives performing the wound in larger and larger arenas. Frank, by becoming the Punisher. Thanos, by becoming the Mad Titan. They are, in that scene, two versions of the same fundamental story, sitting next to each other across an enormous gulf of scale, recognizing each other for what they are. It is one of the strangest and tenderest scenes in the entire Cates run, and it lasts perhaps 3 pages, and it goes by quickly, and most reviewers, when they wrote up the comic at the time, did not even mention it. It is, to my mind, the heart of the whole series. The series ends with the two Thanoses doing what two Thanoses, given enough time, will always do to each other. The present-day Mad Titan, having seen what his future holds, having seen the lonely throne at the end of time, decides he does not want it. Or more precisely, he decides that the King Thanos before him is no longer truly Thanos, because the version of him that ended up alone and loved by death and exhausted by his own victory is not the version of himself he ever wanted to be. He kills the king, or the king kills him, or they kill each other. The exact mechanics are intentionally a bit blurry. What matters is that the comic ends with a small acknowledgement by both versions that there is no real way out of being Thanos. You either die before you become the king, or you become the king and then you die. There is no door that leads out of the room. I think Cates and Shaw's Thanos run is, by some distance, the best Thanos work of the last 15 years, and it sits comfortably alongside Starlin's Infinity Gauntlet as one of the two essential Thanos techs. If you have only seen the films, and you are wondering whether to pick up any of the comics, I would point you first to Starlin and second to Cates, and I would tell you to read them in that order and to give each one time to settle before you read the other. They are doing different things. They are both, in their respective ways, definitive. The character contains both of them. Now we should probably, finally, get to the films. I want to begin the films section in the place the films themselves began him, which is the post-credits scene at the end of The Avengers in 2012. You will remember it. Or maybe you will not, because it was, at the time, completely opaque to most of the audience watching it in cinemas. The scene is brief. A purple-skinned figure in shadow turns slightly toward the camera. Another figure beside him, the other, says something to the effect that to challenge Earth is to court death herself. The purple figure smiles, just slightly. The credits resume. Almost nobody in the cinema audience that night, except for the very small contingent of long-time comics readers, recognized what they were looking at. Thanos, at that point, was a deep cut. He was a character from Jim Starlin's runs 3 and 4 decades earlier, who had not been in the cultural foreground for a long time, who was not, by most people's measures, on the short list of villains the films would obviously be building toward. The smile at the end of The Avengers was, for the people who recognized it, the loudest possible signal that the long game was on. For everyone else, it was a confusing close-up of a purple chin. The actor in that scene, briefly, was a man named Damien Poitier, who played Thanos in just that one shot before the role was eventually handed, more or less permanently, to Josh Brolin. Poitier did the scene at short notice. He has spoken about it in interviews afterward with great good humor. It is one of those small pieces of cinema trivia that comics fans like me enjoy carrying around. The first Thanos on film was somebody most people will never have heard of, who came in for a few hours, smiled, and left. Brolin came on for Guardians of the Galaxy in 2014, and he gave the character, very early in his run, the quiet, slightly bored, slightly amused vocal register that would become, over the next 5 years, the defining sonic feature of MCU Thanos. He sits on a floating throne in a void. He listens to Ronan the Accuser report on the status of the orb. He says, with a small, slight smile, that he is sending Gamora. The voice work in those early Brolin scenes is doing more than the average voice acting performance is asked to do, because Thanos, at that stage of the films, is being introduced almost entirely through tone of voice. The script does not give the audience much. The visuals are mostly the throne. Brolin has to carry, in a few sentences, the sense of a being who is older than everything around him and is conducting his cosmic affairs the way a slightly weary executive conducts a quarterly review. He pulls it off. He is, in those early scenes, exactly the right shade of patiently malevolent. Between 2014 and 2018, Thanos was present in the films mostly as a looming background figure. A scene here, a scene there, a reference, a piece of foreshadowing. He showed up briefly at the end of Age of Ultron in 2015, putting on the gauntlet and saying, with quiet menace, that he would do it himself. A line that, on rewatch, plays as both a story beat and an unintentional commentary on the structural problem of using third parties to obtain the stones. Whoever wrote that line did not realize, probably, that they were writing the actual plot of Infinity War. But the line was right. He did eventually do it himself. And then, in 2018, the Russos and Marcus and McFeely delivered Infinity War, and Thanos finally walked, fully, onto the central stage. I want to talk about Brolin's performance for a moment, because I think it is one of the great under-acknowledged performances in modern cinema, and the reason the entire two-film arc works. Thanos in Infinity War is almost entirely a mocap performance, with a digital body and digital face built on top of Brolin's physical work, and yet the character feels somehow fully present. He has weight. He has small, unfinished gestures. He has, in the very specific way actors of his caliber have, a sense of internal life that you can feel even when you are looking at a purple computer-animated giant on screen. The film is asking the audience to spend a great deal of time with this character. The film is, more daringly, asking the audience to feel for him, at least in glimpses, and to take seriously the possibility that his stated reasons are real reasons. None of that works without Brolin. None of that works without the small, slightly tired, slightly philosophical edge he puts on every line. He is not, in his performance, playing a villain. He's playing a true believer, which is much harder and much more unsettling. The story of Infinity War, stripped to its essentials, is a quest narrative. Thanos wants the 6 stones. The various Avengers and Guardians and assorted other heroes attempt, in different combinations, to stop him from getting them. He acquires them one by one, sometimes by violence, sometimes by negotiation, sometimes by performing what he himself describes as the necessary sacrifice. By the end of the film, he has all 6. He stands in a small hut on his old home planet, his work done, the war over, and he raises his left hand, and he snaps, and half of all life in the universe ceases to exist. The film opens, structurally, in the aftermath of a sequence we did not see. The Asgardian refugee ship, fleeing the destruction of Asgard from the end of the previous Thor film, has already been intercepted. The audience comes into the story already too late. The first images we get are of a broken ship in deep space, of bodies of Asgardian civilians strewn across the floor, of the survivors of the cosmic catastrophe of the previous film, now reduced, in the opening minutes of this one, to a much smaller group of survivors of a much more recent catastrophe. Thanos is already on board. The Black Order is already moving through the corridors. Heimdall, dying, manages to send Hulk back to Earth as a kind of message in a bottle. Loki, in the final play of his long arc of double-dealing and reluctant reform, attempts a sleight of hand against Thanos with the Tesseract, and is, in his characteristic way, slightly too clever and slightly too late. The Mad Titan kills him with a piece of cosmic offhand violence that the film, again to its credit, does not turn into a set piece. It is just a small, terrible moment. Loki's neck gives way. He goes. Thor cradles his brother's body, with the Hulk gone and the ship in pieces around him, and the film cuts away. That is the prologue. That is how the film tells the audience, in its first 10 or so minutes, that the rules have changed. This is not going to be a story where the named major characters are safe. This is going to be a story where the named major characters die, in passing, in the openings of scenes, before the title even comes up. After the title, the film breaks into the structure that will define its runtime, which is a fractured, multi-strand narrative in which the audience follows several different teams in several different parts of the universe as they attempt, in their separate ways, to deal with the same approaching catastrophe. The Russos and the screenwriters were, in this film more than any of their others, doing the work of pulling together a decade's worth of disparate franchises into a single coherent unit. And the way they do it is by trusting the audience to follow many threads at once. Strange and Stark and Banner and the Cloak of Levitation form one team. Cap and Black Widow and Falcon and the Wakandans form another. Thor links up with Rocket and Groot at one of the great cosmic forges to obtain a new weapon. The Guardians of the Galaxy split into pieces. Vision and Wanda hide in Scotland. The film, with great craft, keeps each thread comprehensible without slowing down. It is, in its construction, almost a relay race. The handoffs are precise. The pace is enormous. And underneath all of it, the audience never loses track of the central fact, which is that Thanos is moving on his own larger schedule through the cosmos, and that every thread the heroes spin will eventually have to converge against him. I want to talk for a moment about the confrontation on Titan in the middle of the film, because it is structurally the closest thing the heroes have to a coordinated assault, and the closest thing the film has to a moment where the plan almost works. Strange, Stark, Parker, Quill, Drax, Mantis and Nebula find themselves on Titan, which is, in the geography of the film, Thanos' ruined homeworld, a planet of broken architecture and red dust and tilted gravities. They have time, before Thanos arrives, to confer briefly. Strange uses the Time Stone to look forward into the possible futures and reports back, in one of the more haunting lines of the film, that he has examined over 14 million possible outcomes and that the heroes win in exactly one of them. The number is large enough to feel meaningless and small enough to feel catastrophic at the same time. It is, I think, one of the better narrative device lines of the franchise, because it gives the audience the texture of impossible odds without giving the audience any specific information about which timeline they are watching. Thanos arrives. The team has prepared, with such care as they could manage, a plan. The plan is, broadly, to immobilize him long enough for Stark and Parker and Drax to pull the gauntlet off his hand. They almost succeed. They have him pinned. Mantis is on his head, using her empathic powers to put him into a kind of trance. The gauntlet is sliding off. The film, for a few seconds, allows the audience to believe that this is the moment, that the heroes are going to pull it off, that the cosmic catastrophe is going to be averted at the midpoint of the runtime, and the remaining 90 minutes will be a long denouement. And then Quill, learning from Nebula that Thanos has killed Gamora to obtain the Soul Stone, breaks the trance by hitting Thanos in the head, and Thanos wakes, and the gauntlet slides back on, and the plan collapses. This sequence has been debated for years in fan circles as the moment when the films allowed their grand cosmic story to be derailed by the emotional impulsiveness of a single character. People have, with some heat, argued that Quill ruined everything. I would gently push back on that reading. The film, in its construction, does not blame Quill. The film, in its construction, has been showing the audience, since the previous Guardians films, exactly the kind of person Quill is, exactly what loss does to him, exactly how his entire selfhood is organized around the people he has chosen as his family. The film is not asking the audience to imagine a Quill who, in that moment, would have behaved differently. The film is asking the audience to recognize that the plan was built on an assumption, namely that all the heroes present would, in the crucial minute, be capable of acting against their own grief, and that the assumption was wrong, and that humanoid beings under sufficient duress do what their grief tells them to do, even when their grief tells them to do something fatal. The point of the scene is not that Quill is a bad team member. The point is that grief, of the specific kind Thanos has just inflicted on him, is not a thing he can wall off in 2 seconds for the sake of a plan. He cannot. He does not. The cosmic plan dies on the small specific shape of one character's love, for one character he has just learned is dead. The film is, in that sequence, doing the thing it is best at, which is showing the audience the small private weights that bring large public efforts down. The Wakanda battle, simultaneous in screen time with much of this, plays a slightly different game. Wakanda has agreed, at T'Challa's invitation, to host the attempt to remove the Mind Stone from Vision's forehead, an operation Shuri is undertaking in the central laboratory. The Black Order arrives, bringing with them an army of Outriders, which are the 4-armed, eyeless, ravenous foot soldiers of Thanos' war engine. The Wakandans, alongside Cap and Widow and Falcon and Rhodes and Banner in the Hulkbuster armor, and Bucky returned from his Wakandan rest, mount a long defensive line against them across the open fields beyond the city. The battle is large. The film does not, however, try to make it as large as the eventual battle of Endgame will be. The Russos understand that this battle is functioning as the holding action, the buying time sequence, the part of the film whose narrative job is not to be won, but to last long enough. The Wakandans hold the line. The Outriders break against it in waves. Heroes fall. Heroes rise. The fight goes on long enough for the film to handle several other strands of its plot in crosscut. There are small grace notes throughout. T'Challa and Cap leading the charge together. 2 soldiers with similar shields, similar capacities, similar stillness. Okoye and the Dora Milaje at the center of the line, holding the most exposed ground. M'Baku and the Jabari coming down from the mountains to flank the field. Wanda, at last released from her hiding place with Vision, joining the fight in time to demonstrate, in the film's terms, that her power is on a different scale than nearly anyone else on the field. Thor, arriving by Bifrost late in the day with the new weapon, Stormbreaker, freshly forged on Nidavellir, cutting through the Outrider army with a kind of grim and partial joy. These are the small moments the Wakanda sequence offers. They are, in the construction of the film, the things it needs to land in order for the audience to feel that the side of the Avengers is at full strength, the maximum effort, the full assembled response, before the final outcome lands, and the audience has to accept that even the full assembled response was not, in the end, enough. Wanda, in the closing minutes of that battle, is asked to do the worst thing the film asks any character to do. Thanos, having arrived at last on the field, having absorbed everything between him and Vision, stands over the laboratory and demands the Mind Stone. Wanda, who loves Vision, who has only just begun to allow herself to love Vision, who has been hiding with him for what is, in the film's chronology, only a handful of weeks, is asked by Vision to destroy the stone in his forehead with her own power, even though doing so will kill him. She refuses. She refuses for as long as she can. And then, in a scene the film holds longer than most of its other emotional beats, she does it. She places her hand on him. Her power flows in. The stone breaks. Vision dies. Elizabeth Olsen does work in that scene that I keep going back to. She is performing in real time the destruction of the only thing she has loved without complication. She does not look brave. She does not look strong. She looks, simply, like a person whose love is being used as a weapon against itself. And then, in the gut-wrench of the film's central cruelty, Thanos uses the Time Stone to reverse what she has just done, to pull Vision back into being to take the stone for himself anyway. Wanda's sacrifice is undone in front of her, in real time, by a man who can simply rewind the death of her beloved in order to murder him over again. The cruelty of the moment is not, I think, narrative sadism on the film's part. It is rather the film's most honest statement about what Thanos is. He is the thing for which your loss does not, in the end, count. He undoes your worst day. He repurposes it. He takes the stone from the corpse and walks out. He raises his hand. He snaps. The film cuts to the small hut on the small farm and the sun coming up and a long shot of him sitting in silence. And then, in pieces, the dust comes for half of everyone the audience has come to love. Parker, who's the hardest one, says he doesn't feel so good. Stark holds him on the dusty ground of Titan and looks in close-up, like a man whose interior has been emptied. Black Panther turns to dust in the field. Bucky turns to dust. Wanda turns to dust at the side of the corpse of the man she has already lost. Mantis, Drax, Star-Lord, Strange. The credits roll, and the credits this time are scored in a way that the franchise had not previously allowed itself to use, which is to say almost silent, almost without flourish, the names appearing on the screen as a small piece of mourning rather than a piece of brand building. The first time I watched the film in the cinema, the audience around me did not move during the credits. They sat. Some of them cried. Most of them, I think, were trying to decide whether the film had just ended on what it had appeared to end on, and what that meant, and what they were supposed to do with the feeling. It was, in a way, the largest emotional risk a film of that scale had taken in my lifetime, and the risk paid off, because the audience took the story seriously, and the franchise had earned by then the right to be taken seriously. The film, to its credit, does not show the snap itself with any kind of bombast. The snap is small. It is almost intimate. He just does it, and then he sits down, and then he watches the dust come for some of the people we love. The Russos and the writers understood, I think, what Stalin had understood in 1991, which is that the moment of cosmic mass death is best handled at a quiet emotional volume. Loud snap, large explosion would be wrong. Quiet snap, small breath, small sit down, the slow camera lingering on Stark holding what's left of Parker as Parker apologizes for dying. That is the way to film it. The film knows that. The Russos, on a good day, are some of the best craftspeople in the franchise, and Infinity War, more than any of their other films, is the one that works on the strength of the small choices rather than the big ones. The Vormir sequence in the middle of the film is the moment everything else hinges on. I touched on it earlier. Thanos arrives on Vormir with Gamora in order to obtain the Soul Stone and is met by the Red Skull, who is, in one of the franchise's more elegant Easter eggs, alive after all. Exiled to the role of Stonekeeper after the events of the first Captain America film in 2011. The Skull explains the cost. The Soul Stone, in order to be acquired, requires the sacrifice of someone the Seeker loves, a soul for a soul, a trade with the universe. The Vormir setting, considered as a piece of production design, is worth a slow look. The planet is rendered in the film as a place of vast windswept cliffs and grey, almost ashen skies, with no flora visible, no water, no architecture except for a single low altar at the top of the highest cliff. The light is the light of perpetual late dusk. The wind is constant. The sound design, in those scenes, drops nearly all the usual orchestral cues that the franchise relies on, and instead lets the wind do most of the auditory work, with only a low strings drone underneath. It is, of all the locations in the film, the one that most clearly signals to the audience that they are about to watch a piece of ritual, not a piece of action. The film has shifted register. The film is preparing the viewer in every craft-level choice for a beat that will work by stillness rather than motion. The Russos, in interviews, have spoken about how carefully they considered the visual style of this single sequence. They were aware, they said, that the success of the entire emotional arc of the two films would hinge on whether the Vormir scene was felt as ritual or as plot. They worked in production to make sure the scene felt like the former. They succeeded. The Red Skull's reintroduction, in the role of the Stonekeeper, is one of the film's small, slightly Borgesian touches. The franchise's first cinematic villain, the man Captain America fought in the first film of the entire MCU back in 2011, has been retconned in a single sentence into a wandering spectral guide for whoever comes seeking the Soul Stone. He has been on Vormir, the implication is, for decades. He has watched whoever has come, has explained the rule, has watched them, in most cases, fail to make the necessary trade. He has become, in his exile, something close to a monk. The performance, by Ross Marquand replacing Hugo Weaving, is calibrated for the new register. It is quiet, formal, slightly weary. The Skull, in his original appearances, was a fascist commander. The Skull, on Vormir, is something else. He has been alone with the rule of the stone for so long that he has stopped being a person with desires. He simply explains. He gestures toward the cliff. He waits. Thanos receives this news, and the camera holds on his face. And you can see, very clearly, the moment he understands that the universe is going to demand of him exactly the thing he has spent his life pretending he did not have. Gamora, beside him, laughs at first, because she does not believe he is capable of love, because she has spent her life understanding him as a being whose ostensible affection for her was a tool. She laughs, and then she sees that he is crying, and she stops laughing, and the film, with great care, lets you see her realize what is about to happen before he does it. Brolin's work in that scene is, I think, the best work of his career, and Zoe Saldana's work matches it. The two of them stand on that windswept cliff and do, in 2 or 3 minutes of screen time, something that other films would have needed an entire act to achieve. They convince you that the relationship between them, however twisted, is real. The love is real. In the warped form he is capable of giving it. And the sacrifice, when he makes it, is felt as a sacrifice, not as a strategy. He gains the stone. He loses her. The film does not let him off the hook for it, but it also does not let the audience off the hook of having seen, for a single moment, that there is a person inside the monster after all. The moment immediately before the throw is, structurally, the moment the film is asking the audience to do the hardest piece of moral work it asks anywhere in its runtime. Thanos picks Gamora up. She struggles briefly, and then stops struggling, because she understands by then that the struggle does not matter, that the script of the scene has already been written, that she is, in some larger sense, already gone. He carries her to the edge. He looks at her. She does not look away. He pushes her. She falls. The film holds, for a fraction of a second, on the empty edge of the cliff, on the space where she had been standing, on the wind. Then it cuts down to the rock below, to her broken body, to the small pool of red against the grey stone. And then it cuts back to Thanos, alone on the cliff in the morning light, with the Soul Stone now in his palm, glowing the same orange-red as the dawn behind him. He has done the thing. The cost has been paid. The universe has, in its strict accounting, given him the credit he was looking for. He is, in those final seconds of the sequence, a man who has just received exactly the thing he came for. and who is, in the same breath, more emptied than he has been in any of his appearances so far. The trade is real. The trade hurts. The film does not let him pretend otherwise. The end of Infinity War leaves the surviving heroes and the audience in a state of stunned silence. The credits roll. The dust settles. The story has, structurally, ended on a defeat, which is something the films of this scale almost never do. 2018 audiences came out of the cinema in something close to mourning. It was, as a piece of mass media event-making, a quietly remarkable feat. The film had earned the right to do what it did. The 5 years that follow it, in the in-story timeline, were a thing the films would have to handle in the sequel, and the way they handled it is, to my mind, the most interesting story choice in the entire arc. And also, alas, the one most often skipped over in discussion. Endgame, in 2019, picks up immediately after Infinity War, in the small hours of the morning of the world that has just lost half of itself. The opening sequences are quiet. They are domestic. They are, in some scenes, almost unbearably small, given the scale of the catastrophe. Hawkeye is on a picnic with his family. He turns away for a moment. He turns back. They are gone. The film does not show their disappearances on camera. He just turns back, and they are not there. That, in the language of the films, is how a snap looks from inside a single family. It looks like turning your head and finding the seat empty. The opening half hour or so of Endgame is, structurally, a grief film. The surviving Avengers find Thanos. He is on a small farm on a remote planet, growing vegetables, having destroyed the stones in order to ensure his work could not be undone. It is, almost exactly, the ending of Stalin's Infinity Gauntlet from 1991, brought forward and put on screen. The Mad Titan, retired. The Mad Titan, in a small hut, sitting in the garden he planted. The Avengers arrive. They demand the stones. He tells them, with the slow calm of a man who has accepted what he has done, that the stones are gone. Thor, in a small terrible gesture, decapitates him. The act does not undo anything. The stones are still gone. The heroes go home. 5 years pass. The film, more daringly than most films of this scale ever try, jumps forward. That 5-year gap is the most interesting structural choice in the MCU's entire run. The films allow themselves, for the first time, to depict their world as one that has had to live for half a decade with permanent grief, not as a brief beat, not as a setup for a quick reversal, as a sustained, lived-in reality in which the surviving people have built support groups and lost relationships and started new ones and aged. Stark has a daughter. Rogers runs a counseling group for survivors. Hulk is, by this point, a kind of green-tinted scientific celebrity, fully integrated with Banner. The world has moved on in the way worlds do. The dead are still dead. People talk about them sometimes. People do not talk about them sometimes. The grief has settled into the architecture. The rest of the film, of course, is the time heist, the assembling of the stones from across the franchise's own past, the eventual confrontation with a younger version of Thanos, who travels forward through time to meet the heroes at the moment of their attempted snap reversal, and the big final battle in which everything resolves. Most of that material is exactly what you remember it being. The portals opening the assembled heroes, the Stark snap, the fade. What I want to flag rather than rehearse the battle in detail is the difference between 2014 Thanos, the version who comes forward in time, and a Thanos of Infinity War. They are, technically, the same person, separated only by a few years. They are, in their on-screen characterization, very different. The earlier Thanos has not yet won. He has not yet performed the snap. He has not yet had to live with the consequences of his stated philosophy. He is, accordingly, harder. He is less reflective. He is less weighted down. He has the certainty of a man who has not yet found out what his certainty actually costs. When he stands in the rubble of the Avengers compound, in the final battle of Endgame, and tells the assembled heroes that he will tear the universe apart to get what he wants, you believe him in a slightly different way than you believed the older Thanos when he said similar things. Older Thanos was sad about it. Younger Thanos is not yet sad. He has not yet been on Vormir. He has not yet given anything up. He still thinks the win will feel like a win. I think the film does this on purpose, and I think it pays off in the final moments of the battle, when Stark, having taken the stones from him, performs the second snap, and the camera holds on Thanos as he watches his army disintegrate around him, and he sits down slowly on a piece of rubble, and he watches the dust come for him. He does not protest. He does not rage. He sits. He turns to dust. The film does not give him any final speech. He simply ends. Younger Thanos, the one who had not yet learned what winning costs, never gets to learn. He just goes. And the difference between his going and the older Thanos' going in the small hut on the farm is, I think, the whole point of having had two of him on screen across two films. The audience has seen both endings. The audience has seen what it looks like when he wins and pays the price, and what it looks like when he never gets there. Neither version, in the end, gets the thing he wanted. The Iron Man line, the I am Iron Man line, gets a great deal of attention in discussions of that scene, and rightly so. It is one of the great closing lines of any blockbuster of the last 20 years. It is good. It works. But I want to point at a smaller thing, which I think the film does deliberately, and which I think reveals more about what the film is trying to say. In the moments before the snap, when Stark and Thanos and Strange are all looking at each other, Strange holds up a single finger. 1 out of 14 million possible futures, the one in which it works. Strange has, by that point, lived through the loss of the snap and the 5 years and the planning and the time travel and everything else, with the knowledge of that single future in his head the entire time. He has not been allowed to tell anyone. He has had to let everything that has happened happen, because telling anyone would have collapsed the only timeline in which the heroes win. The single raised finger is a piece of cinematic shorthand that contains, in one gesture, all of the cumulative weight of a man who has known, this whole time, what was coming, and has not been permitted to say. It is, I think, the most efficient piece of storytelling in the entire two-film arc, and it functions as a kind of silent benediction over Stark, who is about to do the necessary thing and die for it. The whole final battle, taken as a single sequence, is the longest and most kinetically dense action piece the films had attempted up to that point, and it is built on a series of small choreographic ideas that, in retrospect, feel like they have been waiting in the wings for a decade. The portal's moment, in which Strange and the other masters of the mystic arts open shimmering circles in the air above the broken Avengers compound and the assembled forces of Wakanda and Asgard and the Ravagers and the Guardians and the Sorcerers and the Wasp and a great many others come walking through onto the field at once, is the single piece of film I most clearly remember from my first cinema viewing of Endgame. The audience around me that night made a sound I have heard at perhaps 3 or 4 other films in my entire life. It was not cheering. It was an involuntary, slightly broken open sound, the sound of people who had not realized how much they had needed a particular kind of arrival to land. The score, in that moment, leans on the bass and lets the Avengers theme finally play in its full form, having been withheld for nearly the entire runtime. The film has been waiting to give the audience this exact gift for 2.5 hours. The audience has, in some sense, been waiting to receive it for 10 years. The give and the receive meet on the screen in perhaps a minute of footage, and the minute does the work of all the small choices that had been made up to that point. There is, after the portals, a long string of paired set pieces. Cap finally lifts Mjolnir, which the franchise had hinted at since the unsuccessful party game attempt in 2015 and had been holding for exactly this moment. Thor, looking at Cap holding the hammer, lets out a small delighted laugh. The line, "I knew it," is one of the only fully comedic beats in the whole battle, and it works because Hemsworth's delivery has been earned. The hammer flies. Lightning calls down. Cap by then has spent the entire battle moving with the slow, grim certainty of a man at the end of a very long road, and the moment he is given Mjolnir is also, in some way, the moment the film is telling the audience that the long road is almost done. There is a brief shot of him standing in the rubble, with the hammer in one hand and the shield in the other. A Cap from every cover of every Cap comic that any Cap reader has ever loved. And it lasts perhaps 2 seconds, and then he goes back to work. The women of the MQ moment, in which Carol Danvers takes the Stark gauntlet across the field and Peter Parker hands it off, and Wanda and Okoye and Mantis and Shuri and Pepper and Valkyrie all converge to escort her through the fight, has been controversial since the film came out, because of the way it foregrounds, perhaps a little too cleanly, a piece of cultural commentary the franchise had not always done well. I will say that on rewatch, it lands better than I expected it to land on first viewing, because the rest of the battle is so chaotic, and because the moment is so brief, and because the choreography of the shot has, beneath its political signal, the simple visual pleasure of seeing characters who have rarely shared screen time at all, suddenly all in the same panel. It is, in comic book terms, a splash page, and splash pages have their place. The Russos, for all their occasional miscalculations, knew when to lay one on the table. This was a place. They laid one. Carol's intervention against Thanos, late in the battle, is the moment the film comes closest to giving the audience the easy resolution it has been promising for the entire runtime. She arrives, breaks his ship apart, comes down through the rubble, and engages him directly. She is, of all the heroes on the field that day, the only one whose raw power is truly on the order of his own, and for perhaps a minute the audience is allowed to believe that she will simply tear the gauntlet off his hand and the day will be won. Thanos, with characteristic patience, removes the Power Stone from the gauntlet, holds it for a single second, and headbutts her with it, and she is knocked across the field. The film does not let her win the day. The film, in its construction, has always known that the day will be won not by the strongest hero, but by the one who is willing to pay the necessary price. And the necessary price is not strength, but life. And Carol, having only just rejoined the timeline, is not the right narrative shape to carry that price. The film hands the moment back to Stark, who has been with us since 2008, who has carried the franchise on his shoulders for over a decade, and who has, at last, found the door he was always going to walk through. The moment Stark performs the snap is filmed with great care. The stones move from the gauntlet on Thanos' hand, glimmering, across the small space between them and into the nanite gauntlet that Stark has, in the seconds before, fashioned from his own armor. Thanos sees them go. He attempts the snap, and his hand makes the gesture, and nothing happens. He looks at his fingers. He looks at Stark. Stark, in the closing inch of his life, raises his right hand, and the stones are now on his glove, and he looks at Thanos with the smallest possible smile, and he says the line, "I am Iron Man." And he snaps. The stones fire through him. His arm is destroyed. His face is burned. The army of Thanos turns to dust across the field in great clouds. Thanos himself, last to go, sits down on a piece of rubble, looks out at the empty space where his soldiers were standing seconds ago, and turns to dust. He does not say anything. He does not even, especially, look surprised. He looks, more than anything else, tired. The film holds the shot perhaps 2 seconds longer than a different film would have held it, and then he is gone. The shot of Stark in the rubble, in the moments after the snap, is the shot the whole film has been building toward, and the film knows it. Pepper arrives, kneeling beside him. Parker, restored to the timeline, scrambles to him and says, "He did it. He did it." And Stark cannot speak, and Parker tries to keep him talking by pretending the conversation can continue. Rhodey arrives. They make a small triangle around him in the rubble. The film does not, even now, push the moment. It lets it sit. Pepper, in close-up, tells Stark, in the gentlest possible voice, that they will be okay, that he can rest. That is the cue. Robert Downey Jr., who has been playing the part for 11 years by then, who has built the character from the small scrap of a Jon Favreau film in 2008 into the central pillar of a global franchise, gives, in his closing seconds on screen, a piece of acting that I would defend against any other piece of acting in mainstream cinema of the same decade. He does very little. He looks at her. The arc reactor in his chest, the same one in different forms he has worn since the first film, fades and goes dark. He goes. The film cuts. Stark dies. The funeral plays. The film, with surprising restraint, lets the funeral be quiet. There is a small assembly of characters around the lake. There is a kind of paper and flowers vessel sent out onto the water with the arc reactor at its center. The shot pulls back slowly. The score is, by Russo film standards, restrained. Stark, the man who started the whole MCU in 2008, is given the kind of farewell that the films had been building up to for a decade, and the camera does not push the moment. It just lets it sit. And Thanos, by then, has already turned to dust. He is not at the funeral. He does not need to be. The film has, in its quiet way, paid him off as well, even though his payment was on the battlefield instead of by the water. The Mad Titan ended in the rubble of an Avengers compound, sitting on a piece of broken concrete, watching the universe correct itself around him. He ended without a snap of his own. He ended without his army. He ended without any of the things he had built. He ended in a way that I think is faithful to the deeper logic of the comics character, alone with the failure of his own project. Let me step back, because we have been moving a long time, and I want to do the thing I always like to do near the end of these videos, which is to sit with the whole shape of the story and ask what it is, finally, about. Not in the sense of theme, not in the sense of message, in the sense of the small private set of recurring questions a character keeps walking into, and that the writers, across the decades, keep finding new ways to ask through him. What strikes me, when I think about the whole Thanos arc laid end to end, is how much of it is about the inability of any amount of acquired power to fix a wound that originated in early childhood. He is, from his birth, a being who was not loved by the person who should have loved him first. His mother could not look at him. The community of Titan could not entirely accept him. The figure in the hood, who at last paid attention, was Death, who is not, finally, capable of loving anyone. And from those starting conditions, he sets out into the galaxy to build the largest possible apparatus of attention, the largest possible audience, the largest possible cosmic recognition, in the hope that the original wound can be retroactively healed. It cannot. The wound is too early. The conditions for healing it are no longer available. The mother is dead by his own hand before he was old enough to know what he was doing. There is no door back. There is no way to be looked at last, with love by the person who first did not look at him with love. Every act of cosmic conquest is a substitute offering at an altar that does not exist anymore. That is, I think, the actual story of Thanos. It is not a story about a Malthusian. It is not a story about an aspiring god. It is the story of a boy in a field with a stick and a drawing of a skull, who spent the rest of his life trying to make the universe sit with him while he looked at it. The drawing got bigger. The skull got bigger. The audience got bigger. The original loneliness did not ever get smaller. By the time he is sitting on the King Thanos throne at the end of the universe, in the Kate's run, with nothing left around him except the residue of cosmic death, he is exactly the same boy he was at 8 or 9. He has just acquired enough power to be alone at a planetary scale instead of a personal one. He has not changed. He has only become more visible. The films, in their slightly different framing, get at a closely related version of this. MCU Thanos, with the Malthusian motivation, is a man who has decided that the only way to be at peace with the universe is to reshape it according to a private and rigid logic, and who is so committed to the logic that he cannot acknowledge that the logic is, in fact, a coping mechanism for an older trauma he never names. The film does not, in either Infinity War or Endgame, give us a full origin sequence for him. We do not see the boy in the field. We do not see Suisan. We see instead a Thanos who is already complete in his certainty, and who can offer, in conversation with Gamora and Stark and Strange, a fully articulated philosophical justification for what he is about to do. The film's Thanos has, in effect, completed the work of intellectualizing his trauma. He no longer feels it. He only argues it. That is its own kind of horror, and Brolin plays it perfectly. The man who can recite his reasoning without flinching, who can speak the words sacrifice and balance and necessary with the calm of a long-time believer, is the man who has rendered himself permanently inaccessible to the help he might once, as a child, have been able to receive. The smallest moments are the ones I keep coming back to. Not the snap, not the battle. The small ones. The cheek tear on Vormir. The way Brolin's voice catches, just slightly, when he tells Gamora about the day he found her, and how she had been a starving child on a dying world, and how he had given her a small knife to play with so she would not have to look at what was happening around her. He tells her this in Infinity War, as a memory, framed as a tender story. She receives it with the slow horror of a person realizing that the parental memory she had been told all her life was a sanitized version of an event that was, in fact, the systematic destruction of her people, with her cleaned and presented to her killer father as a kind of trophy. The two of them in that scene are remembering different versions of the same morning. He remembers a tender adoption. She remembers a planet on fire. The scene runs perhaps 2 minutes. It does more in those 2 minutes than most films do in their whole runtime. There is the way Brolin's eyes go slightly unfocused at the end of Infinity War, after the snap, when he is sitting in the small hut on the small planet, and the camera holds on him in close-up. He is not triumphant. He is not even especially satisfied. He is just present in his own body, having done the thing he had spent his life trying to do, and discovering in the silence afterwards that the thing he had been trying to do does not, in fact, make the noise inside him go away. The shot is brief. He looks at the sun coming up over his small farm. The sun does not seem to comfort him. He is alone. He stays alone. The film ends. There is the small smile from the Tom Vaughan Lawler performance as Ebony Moore, the one he gives early in the film when he is monologuing over the captured Doctor Strange. And you can see, on Moore's face, that he is enjoying himself. That smile, in a film that is doing many things at once, is one of the things the film does without quite advertising. The Mad Titan's herald is in his element. He's glad to be at work. The pleasure he takes in it tells you what kind of organization Thanos has built around himself, and what kind of people are drawn into the orbit of a being like him. They are not all killers. Some of them are speakers. Some of them like the speaking. There is the small, almost incidental moment in Endgame, in the time travel sequence, when past Nebula and present Gamora meet for the first time. Gamora does not know past Nebula. Past Nebula knows Gamora as her sister, but a sister from a different timeline, one she has not yet learned to love. The two of them have a brief, careful, exploratory conversation, while the larger plot mechanics continue around them. And in that conversation, you can see two people who, in some other version of the story, would have been friends from the start. Karen Gillan, in particular, does a tiny thing with her eyes in that exchange that I have always found quietly moving. She is, for a moment, looking at the sister she could have had, and that sister is looking back, and they are both about to be separated again by the requirements of the plot. They make their peace with the brevity of the moment. They move on. These are the small things. They are the things that, when you have watched the films enough times and read the comics enough times, accumulate into the actual experience of the character. The cosmic scale of him is, in the end, a frame. The real story is in the corners. There are, of course, a great many things we did not get to tonight, and I want to name a few of them in passing, in case you want to look them up later, or in case I make videos about them at some point in the future. We did not really talk about Adam Warlock, who is, in the comics, the great cosmic counterweight to Thanos, and whose story is, in many ways, the inverse of the Mad Titan story. Warlock is a being created originally by other forces, who comes to consciousness already powerful, and who spends most of his existence trying to figure out what to do with himself in a universe that has made him without consulting him. He is, structurally, the kind of being Thanos could have been if he had been born wanted. The two of them, across the Starling comics, have one of the most interesting villain and foil relationships in any medium. The films have begun, in fits and starts, to bring Warlock into the picture, and what they end up doing with him remains, at the time of this recording, a thing I am watching with curiosity. Warlock's history, in the comics, runs across several decades and several different creative teams, and it has the kind of branching, repeatedly rebooted quality that long-running cosmic comic characters often have. He started in the late 1960s as him, in some Fantastic Four issues by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, as a being created in a vat by a group of scientists who were attempting to engineer the next stage of evolution. He escaped from his creators almost immediately, refused to play the role they had designed for him, and went off into the cosmos to find his own way. Later writers, including Roy Thomas, and then most consequentially Jim Starlin, picked him up and rebuilt him, and gave him the gold and red costume, and gave him the soul gem fixed in his forehead, and gave him a long, slightly Christ-shaped messianic arc in which he kept dying and being reborn and being killed and being reborn. By the time Starlin was finished with him, in his peak run, Warlock had become one of the strangest leading men in cosmic Marvel, a hero whose entire selfhood is a kind of ongoing argument with the fact of his own existence. He did not ask to be made. He is not entirely sure what he is for. He keeps trying to find out. He keeps being put through forms of cosmic suffering that, in the way of these stories, both deepen him and unfit him further for the ordinary business of being a person. The relationship between Warlock and Thanos is structurally one of the more interesting villain-foil pairings in superhero comics, and it is interesting precisely because the two of them, underneath the cosmic costumes and the elaborate plot machinery, share a single structural problem. They are both, in their respective ways, beings who came into existence under conditions that did not afford them an ordinary path into selfhood. Warlock was made by scientists in a vat. Thanos was born to a mother who could not look at him. Neither of them had the small ordinary scaffolding of being wanted and welcomed and given a place. Both of them, in adulthood, have spent enormous amounts of cosmic effort trying to construct, on their own, the meaning that ordinary beings inherit from their families and communities. Warlock has done it through messianic sacrifice. Thanos has done it through cosmic violence. The two strategies are, in one sense, opposite. They are also, in a deeper sense, two responses to the same original problem. The comics, when they put Warlock and Thanos in the same room, are not just staging a hero-villain fight. They are staging a debate between two ways of handling the same wound. The fights, the gauntlets, the cosmic abstractions are the dressing. The argument underneath them is the real story. Stalin, in his finest moments, has written that argument with great care, and the climactic scenes between Warlock and Thanos in the original Infinity Gauntlet, and in its various sequels, are some of the high points of his career. The two of them, in those scenes, speak to each other not as opponents, but as the two beings in the universe who are most likely to understand each other, and who, accordingly, can spare each other none of the things friends might have spared each other. They cut to the center. They are not gentle. The cuts land because they land on real material. The reader, when it works, has the experience of watching two old friends argue across a chasm that neither of them ever managed to close. It is one of the things the comics can do that the films, with their compressed runtimes and their wider audiences, have not yet found space to do. I hope they get there. I am not sure they will. The character of Warlock, as the films have introduced him, has been simpler so far, and the path back to the Stalin version, if there is one, will be long. We did not get to Drax the Destroyer's original comics backstory, which is one of the strangest and saddest in the Marvel canon. Drax, in the comics, is the reincarnated spirit of a human father whose family was killed by Thanos during one of the Mad Titan's early visits to Earth, and who was given a powerful artificial body by a cosmic entity for the express purpose of hunting Thanos down. The films use a version of this, simplified and Drax-shaped, and the Bautista performance is so beloved that I would not want to interfere with it, but the comics version is, structurally, much darker and worth looking into if you ever want to be quietly sad for an afternoon. We did not get to the Annihilation events, which were 2006 and onwards over at Marvel. Written largely by Keith Giffen and Dan Abnett and Andy Lanning, and which represent a different cosmic event line from the one Thanos most usually anchors. Annihilation is more of a Nova story and a Star-Lord story, and Thanos is in it, in pieces, but the focus is elsewhere. The Annihilation books are quietly some of the best cosmic comics Marvel has ever published, and if you have only read Stalin and Kate's, the Abnett and Lanning era is the next place to go. We did not get to the various other adopted children of Thanos who have appeared across the comics. There have been more than just Gamora and Nebula. There are sons in some continuities, In addition to Thane, there are members of his extended family who have shown up across various crossovers and side events, and most of them have not had the staying power of the daughters, but a few of them are interesting, and the comics historian in me wishes we had time for them tonight. We did not get to Eternity properly. Eternity is the cosmic entity that personifies the entire living universe, and who has, across the comics, been Thanos' most direct cosmic counterpart and occasional opponent. The relationship between Thanos and Eternity is one of the more philosophically interesting relationships in cosmic Marvel, and it deserves its own video one of these nights. And we did not get to Thanos as a parental figure in the broader sense, beyond the daughters, although we touched on it. The way Thanos performs fatherhood across his various continuities is one of the most consistent through lines of the character. He is not, in any version, a good father, but he is, in every version, performing the role with great seriousness and trying, in his crooked way, to pass on what he understands to be wisdom. The fact that the wisdom is poisoned and the children he raises are damaged does not seem to dissuade him from doing the work. He keeps trying. He keeps producing children. He keeps performing the rites of parenthood. There is in that a piece of him that I think the comics have only partially explored, and that I would like to see a future writer take seriously. A man like Thanos, who has never been parented well, trying so very hard, in his own ruined way, to parent. That is its own story. That is a story for another night. For now, though, let me leave you with one more image, and then I'll let you go. I keep thinking, when I think about Thanos, about the very last shot of him in the small hut on the small farm at the start of Endgame. He has been, by then, doing his quiet work in the garden. He has destroyed the stones. He has accepted what he has done. The Avengers have just arrived to take their revenge. He sits with them, briefly, before Thor ends him. He looks tired. He has done the thing he set out to do. He has lost everything except the satisfaction of having done it. And in the moment just before the axe comes down, he is, I think, more peaceful than he has ever been in any of the films. He has nothing left to want. He has done the offering. He has paid the price. Mistress Death, in his original comics framing, has not turned to him with love because she cannot, but the universe has, in its quiet way, finished with him, and he has finished with it. He is, in those last seconds, what he never managed to be in any of his triumphs. He is at rest. It is not redemption. I do not want to oversell it. He has done unspeakable things, and the films do not pretend otherwise. The 5 years that follow his small farm scene are a record of the grief he caused. The children he raised, the daughters he tortured, the planets he hollowed out, are not magically restored by the small moment of peace in his garden. The story does not work that way, and would be the worse for it if it did. But there is, in the small image of him sitting on the bench in the early light, before the heroes arrive, something close to the rest he has spent his entire fictional life trying to find. He has put down the gauntlet. He has put down the army. He has put down, at last, the long ache that drove him. It is not enough. It is, however, the most he was ever going to get. I think one of the reasons the character has lasted across these many decades, with so many different writers handling him in so many different ways, is precisely that the wound at the center of him is, in its broad shape, a wound a great many readers and viewers have some version of. Not many of us were rejected by our mothers at birth. Not many of us grew up to lead cosmic armies. But the smaller, more ordinary shape of the experience he is built around, the experience of being a child who could feel, before they had the language to name it, that the adults around them were holding themselves at a slight distance, The experience of being the kid in the family or the classroom that nobody quite gathered to. The experience of trying, in 100 small and embarrassing ways, to become the kind of person the people you love will at last gather to. That experience is, by some measure, extremely common. The character of Thanos, in his cosmic scale way, dramatizes the long arc of a particular response to that experience. He shows what happens when the response is allowed to grow without ever being interrupted by anyone who can sit with the wound and not flinch from it. The skull on the dirt, in the field, with a friend walking away. The fleet, in deep space, with the planets burning. The same gesture. The same boy. Only the scale has changed. That is, I think, the reason he keeps coming back. Writers keep finding new ways to ask the same question through him, because the question is one of the questions human beings keep asking through their stories. What happens to a person who is not gathered to? What that person, in the absence of being gathered to, becomes, what it might have taken, at the right moment, to interrupt the long road. The films do not especially answer those questions. The comics do not especially answer those questions. But they keep asking. They keep returning to the small purple child in the field. They keep, in their respective ways, sitting with him for a little while longer. That is, in the end, what fiction does at its best. It sits with the wound. It does not, especially, heal anything. But it does, by the act of attention, what the original adults in the story failed to do. It refuses to look away. That is the Mad Titan, more or less, end to end, across 5 decades of stories. Beginning as a child in a field on Titan, with a stick and a drawing, ending as an old man on a small farm, waiting for his executioners. The interval between those two images is filled with the largest possible amount of cosmic noise. The interval, when you take the noise away, is a single quiet life lived alongside a wound that never closed. The boy he was. The being he became. The same loneliness in both. That is enough for tonight. The story does not end here, of course. He keeps coming back. New writers find him. New films will, in time, return to him in some form, in some continuity, with some new dimension of his interior worked out. The character is too useful to leave alone and too rich to be exhausted. Whoever picks him up next will find some new door inside the house. I look forward to the door. For now, though, this is a nice place to rest. Wherever you are. Whatever time it is, the Mad Titan is on his bench in the small light of his small farm, and the universe has, briefly, gone quiet around him. He has nothing he needs to do. There is nowhere else he needs to be. And neither, just for these few hours, do you. Sleep well.